The day began, as it always did, with the shriek of the factory whistle. It was a sound that didn't so much wake the settlement of Zavitsk, 42, as it did pierce the thin veil of its collective slumber. The whistle was the town's metallic heartbeat, its iron-lunged taskmaster, its unyielding metronome. At 6 o'clock sharp, it sliced through the gray pre-dawn light, a promise and a command in one, echoing off the concrete facades of the identical four-story apartment blocks and rattling the thin glass of their windows. For Anna, it was the sound of inevitability. She lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar stirring of the dormitory room she shared with her friends. The creak of a mattress as Daria, ever the reluctant riser, burrowed deeper under her threadbare blanket. The quiet, methodical rustle of Elena turning a page in the book she'd been reading by the faint glow of the hallway light that bled under their door. The soft, almost inaudible sigh from Svetlana's cot in the corner, a sound of such profound innocence it made Anna's chest ache. Zavitsk, 42 wasn't a town on any official map. It was a settlement of the urban type, a sterile designation for a place that existed for one reason alone, to serve the colossal metallurgical plant that squatted at its heart. The factory was a sprawling beast of brick, steel, and smoke, a monument to the 5-year plan that had birthed it decades ago. It was the provider of all things: work, housing, purpose, and the perpetual layer of fine, gray dust that settled on every surface, inside and out. It was their entire world, walled in by the dense Ural forests on one side and the endless, rolling steppe on the other. A self-contained universe running on a schedule of 3 8-hour shifts. Anna swung her legs over the side of her bed, the cold linoleum a shock to her bare feet. She was an observer by nature, a collector of small, quiet details that others seemed to miss. She saw the way the early morning light struggled through the grimy window pane, illuminating the suspended dust motes in a swirling, transient galaxy. She noticed the new crack that had appeared in the plaster near the ceiling, a tiny fissure mapping its slow, patient journey towards the corner. Her father, a man who had given his life to the construction of a dam just like this factory, had always told her to see the poetry in the concrete, the grand design and the collective effort. She tried, but mostly she just saw the cracks. Her job was in the factory's supply depot, a relatively quiet corner away from the deafening roar of the main foundry. She kept ledgers, tracking the endless flow of bolts, bearings, and graphite rods. It was meticulous, solitary work that suited her temperament. It gave her time to think, to exist within the quiet hum of her own thoughts, a small mercy in a world built on the principle of the collective. If you lie there any longer, the whistle will grow legs and drag you to the line itself. Elena's voice cut through the quiet, crisp, and devoid of sentiment. She had already dressed, her dark hair pulled back in a severe, practical bun. Elena was the mind of their small group, her intellect a sharp, polished tool. She read books Anna had never heard of, borrowed through a network of whispers, samizdat copies with faded, typewritten pages that she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard. She spoke of things like structural inevitability and dialectical tension, words that made Anna feel both ignorant and vaguely worried. Daria groaned from beneath her covers. 5 more minutes, Comrade General. The proletariat is weary. The proletariat will be late, Elena retorted without looking up from her book. And Comrade Yevgrafov will have the proletariat scrubbing floors during the lunch break. Again, that was enough to stir Daria. She sat up in a cascade of tangled blonde hair and grumbled complaints, her natural ebullience momentarily dimmed by the early hour. Daria was their heart. She found joy where Anna saw only gray. She would sing forbidden, sentimental songs under her breath while working, her fingers flying over the intricate wiring of an electrical panel. She dreamt of trips to Moscow to see the Bolshoi, of a new dress made of real crepe de chine, of a life painted in colors brighter than industrial gray and revolutionary red. Svetlana was already up and dressed, her movements small and timid. She had arrived from a distant village only 6 months ago, barely 18, with eyes that still held the wide, startled look of a field mouse thrust into the clamor of the factory floor. She was all soft edges and blushing cheeks, a fragile bloom in a garden of steel. The older women in the dormitory, including Anna and her friends, had taken her under their collective wing, protecting her from the coarser elements of factory life. Marina, the 5th member of their unofficial family, often said Svetlana reminded her of a porcelain doll she'd seen once in a shop window before the war. Marina was already gone. She worked the earliest shift in the kitchens, her gnarled, capable hands kneading dough for the hundreds of loaves of dense, black bread that would fuel the factory for the day. Marina was their anchor, their living history. She had survived the war, the purges, the famines. She rarely spoke of the past, but it lived in the quiet wisdom of her eyes and the deep lines etched around her mouth. She had seen directors come and go, she'd say with a shrug. The factory remains. The five of them had gravitated towards each other, an alliance of circumstance that had deepened into a genuine, unspoken bond. They were a small, self-sufficient island in the vast, churning sea of the collective. Later, in the Stalavea, the cavernous factory canteen, the air was thick with the smell of strong, chicory-laced coffee, boiling buckwheat, and the low murmur of hundreds of conversations. They sat at their usual table, the din of familiar comfort. It was here that the news first reached them, carried on the currents of gossip that flowed more freely than the watery kasha. "Did you hear?" A woman from the assembly line leaned over from the next table. "Old Yevgrafov is out. Retired." Darya's eyes widened. Retired? He looked like he was carved from the same granite as the Lenin statue. "Nerves, they say," the woman whispered, enjoying her role as the bearer of tidings. "Doctor's orders. But the real news is the replacement. They're sending someone new. From Moscow." The word Moscow fell onto their table with a tangible weight. Moscow was another world. It meant power, connections, ambition. It meant someone who was not one of them, not forged in the same provincial fire. "Someone from the ministry," another man added, his mouth full of bread. "A real shark, they say. Name's Voronov. Young, too. Not even 40. Elena set her spoon down with a soft click. Her eyes, usually so focused on the text before her, were now sharp and analytical, scanning the room as if gathering data. A shark from Moscow doesn't get sent to a place like Zavitsk, 42, for a quiet retirement. He's here for a reason. Anna felt a prickle of unease, a cold knot forming in her stomach. Old Yevgrafov had been a part of the factory's landscape, a drunkard and a bully, perhaps, but a predictable one. His rages were loud but short-lived, his demands familiar. He was a known quantity. This Voronov was a blank space, an unknown variable inserted into their carefully balanced equation. The formal introduction happened 2 days later. The entire day shift was herded into the main assembly hall, the vast space cleared of its usual clutter. The air, normally vibrating with the percussive symphony of machinery, was unnervingly silent. They stood in regimented rows, a sea of blue and gray work coats, their faces turned towards the makeshift stage at the front, where a podium draped in red velvet had been placed. Comrade Voronov did not look like a factory director. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit, a startling anomaly in their world of functional, shapeless workwear. His shoes were polished to a mirror's shine, and his dark hair was cut with a precision that spoke of barbershops far more sophisticated than the settlement's single chair. He was handsome, in a severe, angular way, with a strong jaw and eyes the color of winter ice. He moved to the podium with a fluid, confident grace that was entirely out of place, yet completely commanding. When he spoke, his voice was not the gravelly roar of a factory man, but a smooth, cultured baritone that carried to the furthest corners of the hall without any need for a microphone. He spoke of the future, of modernization, of new production targets, of the glorious duty they all shared in building the socialist dream. He used all the right words: comrades, collective spirit, glorious labor, but they sounded different in his mouth. They were not the worn, comfortable slogans they were used to, but sharp, weaponized instruments. He spoke with a passion that felt both inspiring and predatory. Anna watched him, mesmerized and repelled. She wasn't listening to the words so much as she was watching his eyes. They swept over the crowd, not as a leader addressing his people, but as a hawk surveying its territory. He didn't see a collective, he saw individuals. He saw assets, obstacles, tools. And as his gaze swept over their section, it paused. For a fraction of a second, it rested on Svetlana, who stood between Anna and Darya. It was a look that lasted no more than a heartbeat, but it was enough. It was not a comradely glance. It was an appraisal, a flicker of something cold and possessive that made the hair on Anna's arms stand on end. He catalogued her youth, her fragility, her wide-eyed fear, and moved on. But the moment was burned into Anna's memory. "Well," Darya whispered later, as they walked back to the dormitory, the factory whistle signaling the end of their shift. "He's certainly impressive. Not like old Yevgrafov, smelling of cheap vodka." "He's dangerous," Elena said, her voice flat. "Oh, Elena, you think everyone from Moscow is a KGB agent in disguise?" Darya laughed, though the sound lacked its usual carefree ring. "He's just ambitious." "Ambition in a place like this is a hungry animal, Darya," Elena replied, her gaze distant. "It needs to be fed." They didn't speak of it again, but a subtle shift had occurred. The air in the settlement felt different, charged with a new, uncertain energy. Voronov's presence was everywhere. He didn't sit in his office like the old director. He walked the factory floor, his polished shoes a stark contrast to the grease-stained concrete. He asked questions, his icy eyes missing nothing. He learned names. He remembered faces. The older workers grumbled about the new, stricter quotas. The party sycophants fawned over him, their praise loud and obsequious. But for the young women, it was different. He would stop by their workstations, offering a word of encouragement. A hand might briefly touch his shoulder. A compliment on their diligent work would be delivered a little too close, his voice a low, intimate murmur. These were small things, incidents that could be easily dismissed, easily explained away as the friendly gestures of a modern, engaged leader. But Anna, the observer, saw the pattern. She saw the way Daria's laughter became a little more forced after one of his visits. She saw the way a young weaver from another block would suddenly become flustered and drop her tools when he approached. And she saw the way Svetlana began to make herself smaller, her shoulders perpetually hunched, as if trying to become invisible. The new order had arrived. It had a handsome face, a confident voice, and eyes of ice. And as Anna lay in her bed at night, listening to the familiar sounds of her friends sleeping, she could no longer find comfort in the rhythm of the factory. The whistle still shrieked at 6, but it no longer sounded like inevitability. It sounded like a warning. The cracks in the plaster seemed to be spreading faster now, and the shadow of the factory, a beast she had known her whole life, had begun to take on a new, more menacing shape. It was the shape of a single man. The initial ripples of Comrade Voronov's arrival soon swelled into a relentless tide, subtly but irrevocably altering the social topography of the factory. He was a master of the calculated gesture, the public performance of benevolence that masked a private, predatory intent. He established a new award, the hero of the shift, complete with a small bonus and a photograph on the factory's main bulletin board, the Doska Pakiota. The first recipient was Daria. He announced it himself at the end of a shift, his voice booming with manufactured warmth across the cavernous electrical assembly workshop. He praised her dexterity, her spirit, her embodiment of the bright, forward-looking Soviet worker. He called her to the front and pinned a small, red and gold enamel star to the collar of her work coat. As he did so, his hand lingered on her shoulder, his fingers pressing just a little too firmly, a gesture of ownership disguised as commendation. He leaned in, and under the guise of a congratulatory whisper, his lips brushed against her ear. Anna, watching from 20 feet away, saw the brilliant, genuine smile on Daria's face falter for a fraction of a second. A shadow passed through her eyes, a flicker of confusion and discomfort, before the smile snapped back into place, now slightly brighter, slightly more brittle. The rest of the workshop erupted in polite, obligatory applause. "See," Daria said later, twirling in their small dormitory room, the pin still affixed to her coat. "He's not so bad. A bit familiar, maybe, but he appreciates hard work." She was trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to convince them. "He appreciates a pretty face," Elena countered dryly, not looking up from a technical manual she was studying. "And he appreciates an audience. You were a prop in his little play today, Daria." "You're just jealous," Daria shot back, the words lacking their usual playful sting. She turned away, busying herself with folding her clothes, her movements jerky and defensive. The conversation died, but the pin remained on her coat for the rest of the week, a small, gleaming emblem of a compromised joy. The one bulkhead against this creeping tide was Antonina Petrovna, the supervisor of their workshop. She was a woman seemingly hewn from the same unyielding Ural granite as the mountains themselves. Nearing 60, with a face like a weathered map and hands that could calibrate the most delicate machinery or haul a crate of spare parts with equal ease, she had been at the factory since she was a girl. She ruled her domain, Workshop 7, with an iron will, a gruff demeanor, and a fiercely protective, almost maternal loyalty to the women under her charge. Antonina Petrovna saw through Voronov from the moment he first set his polished shoes on her grease-stained floor. She didn't fall for his charismatic speeches or his hollow praise. She would stand with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable as he made his rounds. When he tried to single out one of her younger workers for a private chat, Antonina would invariably materialize with a loud, demanding question about a delayed shipment or a malfunctioning lathe. She was a master of the well-timed interruption, creating a buffer of cantankerous authority around her girls. "Keep your eyes on your work, not on the shiny suits," she would grumble to Anna, her voice low. "The factory has seen plenty of peacocks. They strut and preen, but they don't know the first thing about making steel. Or about decency. Her small, cluttered office was a sanctuary. It smelled of strong tea, old paper, and a faint, comforting scent of camphor from the ointment she rubbed on her arthritic knuckles. It was a place of refuge, a pocket of the old world where the rules were clear and protection was absolute. Then, one Tuesday in late October, Antonina Petrovna did not come to work. Her absence was a gaping hole in the fabric of the day. A nervous energy rippled through the workshop. By mid-morning, the rumor was confirmed, a severe bout of pneumonia. The factory doctor had confined her to her small apartment, forbidding any movement. They said it was serious. The word hospital was whispered, a place from which older people in Zavitsk 42 did not always return. Without its matriarch, Workshop 7 fell adrift. The familiar rhythm was broken. The sense of security, which Anna hadn't even realized was so tangible until it was gone, evaporated. The shadow that had been lurking at the edges of their lives now lengthened, creeping unopposed into the heart of their small world. Voronov wasted no time. With Antonina Petrovna gone, the buffer was removed. His visits became more frequent, his demeanor more assured. He no longer needed pretexts. On the first day of Antonina's absence, he summoned Daria to his main office at the administrative building. Not the workshop office, but his own seat of power. She was gone for over an hour. When she returned, she was a different person. The light in her had been extinguished. She walked with her head down, her shoulders slumped, her movements stiff and mechanical. Her face was pale and blotchy, her eyes red-rimmed and empty. She went straight to her workbench and began sorting wires, her hands moving with a frantic, unseeing precision. She did not speak. She did not look at anyone. Anna approached her cautiously. "Daria? Are you all right? What did you want?" Daria flinched as if struck. "Nothing," she mumbled, her voice a raw, broken whisper. "Just production targets. New quotas. Leave me alone." But Anna saw the single, dark bruise blooming on her inner arm, just below the sleeve of her coat, shaped vaguely like the imprint of a thumb. She saw the way Daria's hand trembled as she reached for a tool. The laughter was gone. The songs were gone. All that remained was a hollow shell of shame and fear. That night in the dormitory, Daria was silent. She lay on her cot, facing the wall, a rigid line of misery. Elena tried to press her, her voice sharp with concern. "What did he do to you, Daria? You must tell us." "He did nothing." Daria finally exploded, turning over, her face a mask of fury and despair. "He is the director. I was clumsy. I tripped on the stairs. He helped me up. That's all. Now leave me be." She buried her face in her pillow, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. They knew she was lying. The lie was a wall she was building around herself, a desperate attempt to contain a shame too large to articulate. They didn't press further. They let the lie hang in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. The easy camaraderie of their room was fractured. Fear had crept under their door and settled in the center of the floor, a cold, invisible presence. With Daria broken and subdued, Voronov's attention swiveled, like a predator turning from a crippled animal to fresh prey. His gaze fell upon Svetlana. She was the easiest target, the most vulnerable. Her timidity was a magnet for his cruelty. He began with small things. He would accidentally brush against her in the narrow aisles between machines. He would stand behind her as she worked, his presence a suffocating weight, his breath warm on her neck. He praised her work in a low, suggestive voice that made her skin crawl. Anna saw it all. A fierce, protective instinct she didn't know she possessed rose up in her. She became Svetlana's shadow. She rearranged her own tasks to keep her near the younger girl. She invented reasons for them to work together, for Svetlana to accompany her to the supply depot. She created a fragile, two-person shield. "Stay with me today, Sveta," she'd say, her voice casual. "I need help counting the new shipment of copper wire." Svetlana would nod gratefully, her large, terrified eyes clinging to Anna's as a drowning person clings to a piece of driftwood. She began to physically shrink, her posture becoming more and more stooped, as if trying to make herself invisible. She ate less, her already slender frame becoming gaunt. Dark circles appeared under her eyes, testaments to sleepless nights filled with a terror she could not name. The culmination came on a Friday. The end-of-week production reports were due, and Anna discovered a discrepancy in her ledger, a missing consignment of specialized bearings. It was a minor clerical error, but in Voronov's new regime of stringent accountability, it was something she had to resolve immediately. The shipping manifests were kept in a filing cabinet just outside the main administrative offices, in a small, windowless corridor that connected the factory floor to the clean, carpeted world of the management. As she approached the corridor, the roar of the factory floor receded, replaced by an unsettling quiet. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the distant, muffled clatter of a typewriter. The door to Voronov's office was at the end of the hall. It was a heavy, padded door, designed to keep sound in and the factory out. As Anna neared it, she saw that it was not quite latched. It was ajar by the barest of margins, a dark vertical slit in the polished wood. From within, she heard a sound, not words, but a low, guttural murmur. It was Voronov's voice, stripped of its public charm, reduced to a raw, menacing purr. And then another sound, a tiny, choked whimper, a sound like a small animal caught in a trap. It was Svetlana's voice. Anna's blood ran cold. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and run, to pretend she had heard nothing. But she was frozen to the spot, compelled by a horrified sense of duty. She moved silently, her soft-soled work boots making no sound on the worn linoleum. She edged closer to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She angled her head, her breath held tight in her chest, and peered through the narrow opening. The scene inside was a tableau from a nightmare. Voronov's office was large and imposing, dominated by a massive dark wood desk and a wall of bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. But her eyes were not on the decor. They were fixed on the far corner of the room, near a tall, potted fern. He had her cornered there. Svetlana was pressed back against the wall, her body rigid with terror. He wasn't touching her, not yet, but he was standing so close that he blocked any possibility of escape. His large frame loomed over her, a mountain of dark-suited menace. One hand was braced against the wall beside her head, caging her in. He was leaning in, his face inches from hers. "You are a very lucky girl, Svetlana," he was murmuring, his voice a horrifying parody of kindness. "I have taken a special interest in you. I see potential. A girl like you, from a small village, you could go far. With the right guidance. With the right gratitude." Svetlana was as still as a statue, her face a deathly white mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Her eyes were wide and blank, staring at his tie, at his chin, anywhere but at his face. Tears traced silent, clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. Her hands were pressed flat against the wall behind her, as if she were trying to push herself through it, to dissolve into the very plaster. "You are quiet," Voronov continued, his voice dropping lower. "I like that. A woman should know her place. She should be receptive. All you have to do is show me you understand. Show me your appreciation. It's a very small price to pay for a bright future, wouldn't you agree?" He reached out his free hand, slowly, deliberately, and tucked a stray strand of her mousy hair behind her ear. His fingers brushed against her cheek, a touch that was meant to seem gentle but was laden with a terrifying violation. Svetlana flinched violently, a small, convulsive jerk, and let out another choked sob. That was the moment Anna's paralysis broke. A wave of cold, clear rage washed over her, eclipsing her fear. She pulled back from the door just as Voronov straightened up, a look of irritated impatience on his face. She heard him sigh. "We will continue this conversation later," he said, his voice now cold and hard as steel. "Go. And I suggest you think very carefully about your attitude." Anna scrambled back down the corridor, her heart pounding in her ears. She fumbled with the filing cabinet, pulling out a random file, her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold it. She had to look busy. She had to look like she had seen nothing. A moment later, the office door opened fully. Svetlana stumbled out, her eyes still vacant. She didn't see Anna. She moved like an automaton, her gaze fixed on the floor, and scurried back towards the noise and relative anonymity of the factory floor. Then Voronov emerged. He paused in his doorway, adjusting his cuffs, his face a mask of composed authority once more. His eyes swept down the corridor and landed on Anna. For a terrifying second, their gazes met. She saw a flicker of inquiry in his cold eyes, a question of what she might have seen, what she might have heard. She held his gaze, her expression, she prayed, one of neutral, bovine focus on the file in her hands. She forced herself to look confused, as if she were merely a simple worker struggling with a simple task. She could feel his scrutiny like a physical touch, probing for any sign of knowledge, any hint of defiance. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, he gave a slight, dismissive nod and turned, walking away down the hall, his polished shoes clicking with arrogant confidence on the floor. Anna leaned against the cold metal of the filing cabinet, the file slipping from her nerveless fingers and scattering papers across the floor. She didn't bother to pick them up. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her head in her hands, taking deep, shuddering breaths. The ambiguity was gone. Elena had been right. He was a predator. The factory was not a place of glorious labor. It was his private hunting ground. The dormitory was not a home. It was the pen where he kept his prey. The shadow that had been creeping over their workshop was not a shadow at all. It was the tangible, breathing presence of a monster, and it wore the face of their director. And in that cold, silent corridor, Anna knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that observing was no longer enough. The image from the corridor was seared onto the inside of Anna's eyelids. It played on a loop in the darkness behind her eyes. Svetlana's stark white face, the slow, deliberate menace of Voronov's hand, the deadening of the light in a young girl's soul. The quiet hum of the factory, once a monotonous comfort, now sounded like the purr of a great, indifferent beast. Every shadow seemed to lengthen. Every closed door held a new, sinister potential. The world had been tilted on its axis, and Anna could no longer find her footing. That night, the silence in their dormitory room was a physical entity. It was thick and heavy, absorbing all sound. Daria was a still, rigid form under her blanket, a fortress of feigned sleep. Svetlana had huddled on her cot, wrapping her thin arms around her knees, rocking back and forth in a tiny, silent rhythm of misery. Her dinner, a bowl of buckwheat kasha and a slice of bread, sat untouched on her small bedside table, a sad, concrete testament to her state of mind. It was Elena who broke the spell. She had been sitting at their small, shared table, a book open before her, but she hadn't turned a page in over an hour. Her brow was furrowed, her lips pressed into a thin, hard line. She closed the book with a decisive snap that made Svetlana jump. "This has gone far enough," she said, her voice low but carrying the clear, sharp edge of tempered steel. She looked directly at Anna. "You saw something today? In the corridor. I saw it on your face when you came back to the workshop." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Elena had a terrifying ability to read the subtle currents of emotion that flowed between them, to diagnose a problem with the precision of a surgeon. Anna hesitated, her throat tight. To speak the words was to make the horror real, to give it form and weight. But the sight of Svetlana, small and broken in the corner, pushed her over the edge. She took a deep, shuddering breath. "He had her in his office," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "He had her cornered. He touched her." Elena's face hardened, but she showed no surprise. It was as if Anna had merely confirmed a theorem she had already proven in her own mind. "And Daria?" she asked, her gaze flicking towards the silent lump in the other bed. "That bruise on her arm wasn't from a fall, was it?" "No," Anna admitted, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "He summoned her to his office. When she came back, she was like this." A long, heavy silence followed. It was punctuated by a soft, choked sob from Svetlana's corner. "We have to do something," Anna said, the words feeling futile and small against the scale of the problem. "We can't just let this happen." "Do what exactly?" Elena's voice was cold, pragmatic. "Go to the party committee here, at the factory? To Comrade Mironov? He's Voronov's creature. He licks the man's boots clean every morning. Go to the union representative? Old Semyon is a drunk who's more interested in where his next bottle of vodka is coming from than in the welfare of the workers." "Then we go higher," Anna insisted, a desperate hope fluttering in her chest. "To the regional committee. In the city. They're not his people. They have to listen. He's a director, but he's not above the party. No one is." Elena looked at her, a flicker of something that might have been pity in her sharp eyes. "Anna, you still believe in the words they print in Pravda? You believe the system works the way it's supposed to? That there is justice to be found if you just knock on the right door?" She sighed, a sound of weary frustration. "But this isn't a story from a young pioneer's handbook. This is about power. Voronov has it. We don't. He's a man from Moscow, with connections that reach far higher than the regional committee. They sent him here for a reason, to increase production, to break records, no matter the cost. As long as he delivers, they won't care what he does in his office. We are the cost. We are expendable. So we do nothing?" Anna's voice rose, laced with disbelief. "We just watch him destroy them? Destroy us?" "I didn't say we do nothing," Elena corrected her. "I said your idea is naive. It will fail. And when it fails, it will make things worse. He will know we tried to move against him. and his retaliation will be swift and absolute. But Anna couldn't accept it. The image of her father, a true believer who had worked himself into an early grave for the cause, rose in her mind. He believed in the fundamental rightness of the system, in its ability to correct its own flaws. To do nothing was to betray that faith. It was to concede that the monsters could win. "I have to try, Elena," she said, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Even if you're right, I have to be able to look at myself in the mirror. I have to be able to tell myself I didn't just stand by and watch." For a long moment, Elena just stared at her. Then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "All right," she said softly. "All right, Anna. You try. But be careful. Be very, very careful." The plan was simple, and its simplicity was its greatest flaw. Anna requested a day of unpaid leave, citing a sick aunt in a nearby town, a common and rarely questioned excuse. She woke before the factory whistle, dressing in the best clothes she owned, a plain, dark blue dress that had grown a little tight in the shoulders, and a pair of sturdy, sensible shoes. She took the early morning bus, a rattling, smoke-belching machine that served as the settlement's primary link to the outside world. The journey to the regional capital, Sverdlovsk, took nearly 3 hours. As the bus rumbled through the endless forests of pine and birch, Anna rehearsed her speech. She would be calm, factual, and respectful. She would not be emotional. She would present the information as a concerned citizen, a loyal worker reporting a serious problem that threatened the moral fabric of their collective. She clutched her worn handbag, inside of which was a small piece of paper on which Elena had helped her write down key points, dates, names, specific incidents. Elena had insisted on it. "Don't let them confuse you. Stick to the facts," she had instructed. Sverdlovsk was another world. After a lifetime in the gray, functional bubble of Zavitsk, 42, the city was a sensory assault. Wide avenues bustled with cars and trams. Grand, imposing buildings of Stalinist classicism lined the streets, their facades adorned with statues of heroic workers and stern-faced leaders. The people moved with a purpose and a confidence that was alien to her. They were dressed in brighter colors, their faces less etched with the fatigue of factory life. For a moment, Anna felt a crippling wave of inadequacy. She was a provincial girl, a factory worker, about to walk into the heart of regional power. The Regional Party Committee headquarters was the most imposing building of all. It was a massive, gray stone edifice that occupied an entire city block. A giant red star was mounted on its roof, and a granite statue of Lenin, his arm outstretched in a perpetual gesture of exhortation, guarded the entrance. Anna's courage faltered as she stood before it. The building itself seemed to radiate an aura of immense, unassailable authority. It was a physical manifestation of the system Elena had warned her about. Taking a deep breath, she pushed through the heavy oak doors. The interior was even more intimidating. The floors were polished marble, the ceilings impossibly high. The air was cool and smelled of floor wax and old paper. A uniformed guard at a desk in the vast, echoing lobby directed her to the Office of Citizen Complaints, his expression one of utter boredom. The office was a small, stuffy room at the end of a long, dimly lit corridor. A stern-faced woman with a tower of gray hair pinned to her head sat behind a large desk, acting as a gatekeeper. She listened to Anna's request to speak with someone about a serious matter at Zavitsk, 42, with undisguised impatience. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, comrade, but it is urgent." The woman sighed, a sound of profound bureaucratic weariness. "Fill out this form. In triplicate, state the nature of your complaint. Someone will review it. You will be contacted if further action is deemed necessary." Anna's heart sank. A form. Triplicate. This was not the swift, responsive justice she had imagined. This was a wall of paper designed to absorb and deflect. "Please," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "It concerns the new director, Comrade Voronov. It's a moral issue." The mention of a director's name seemed to have a small effect. The woman's eyes narrowed. She studied Anna for a long moment, her gaze sharp and appraising. "Wait here," she said curtly, and disappeared through a door behind her desk. Anna waited for what felt like an eternity. She sat on a hard wooden bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the silence of the corridor pressing in on her. Finally, the door opened again. The woman beckoned her in. The man she was led to was named Comrade Petrov. He was a man in his late 50s, with a soft, doughy face, thinning hair combed carefully over a bald spot, and small, intelligent eyes that peered at her from behind thick-lensed glasses. His office was surprisingly modest, cluttered with teetering stacks of files and overflowing ashtrays. He did not rise when she entered. He simply gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "So," he began, his voice surprisingly soft, "you have a complaint regarding Director Voronov at Zavitsk, 42. Anna's rehearsed speech deserted her. Her carefully constructed points dissolved in a wave of anxiety. She started to speak, her voice halting at first, then gaining momentum as the dam of her fear broke. She told him everything. She told him about the change in the factory's atmosphere, about his inappropriate behavior, about the fear he instilled in the young women. She spoke of Daria's award and her subsequent breakdown, of the bruise on her arm. She described in stark detail what she had witnessed in the corridor outside his office, the scene with Svetlana. Petrov listened without interruption. He did not take notes. He simply leaned back in his chair, his fingertips steepled under his chin, his expression unreadable. His impassivity was more unnerving than any open display of disbelief. Anna felt as though her words, filled with such urgency and horror, were simply floating into the stale air of the office and disappearing without a trace. When she finished, her throat was raw, and she was trembling from the effort. A heavy silence descended upon the room. Petrov continued to stare at her for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then he sighed, a deep, world-weary sound. He picked up a pen from his desk and began to tap it rhythmically on a thick file. "Comrade." He glanced down at the form she had filled out. "Comrade Anisimova, you have made some very serious accusations." "They are true, comrade," Anna said earnestly. "Every word." "Perhaps," he said, his voice still soft, maddeningly calm. "But let us consider the situation. Comrade Voronov was sent to Zavitsk, 42, by the ministry itself. His mandate is to raise productivity, which, I might add, had fallen to frankly disgraceful levels under the previous director. And the initial reports are excellent. Production is up by 12% in just 2 months. 12%. He is a man of great talent and efficiency. But at what cost?" Anna pleaded. "He is terrorizing the women. He is abusing his position." Petrov held up a soft, placating hand. "You are a young woman. Perhaps you are not accustomed to the more dynamic leadership style of a man from Moscow. What you perceive as terror, perhaps he perceives as motivation. What you see as abuse, perhaps is merely a misunderstanding. A cultural difference, you might say." Anna stared at him, dumbfounded. "A cultural difference? You mentioned 2 of your friends," he continued, his tone becoming slightly sharper. "Comrade Daria Ivanova and Comrade Svetlana Popova. Have they come forward? Have they filed a complaint?" "No," Anna admitted, her stomach sinking. "They are too afraid." "I see," Petrov said, his voice laced with a new, subtle layer of skepticism. "So you are speaking for them, without their consent. You, and you alone, have witnessed these alleged incidents." "Elena, my other friend, she knows. She believes me." "And has she filed a complaint?" "No. So we are left with your testimony. The testimony of one worker against a highly effective and respected director." He leaned forward, his soft face hardening. "Let me be frank with you, Comrade Anisimova. An accusation like this, if proven false, is not a small matter. It is slander. It is a malicious attempt to undermine a party appointee. It is an act of political sabotage, and that is a very, very serious offense." The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare on the desk between them, as real and as solid as the overflowing ashtray. "I am telling the truth," Anna whispered, her last vestiges of hope crumbling. Petrov stood up, signaling the end of the interview. "Your concerns have been noted," he said, the words a hollow, bureaucratic dismissal. "The party will, of course, look into the matter. We take the moral fortitude of our leaders very seriously. You may go." He turned away from her and stared out the window at the bustling city street below, his back a wall of finality. Numbly, Anna rose and walked out of the office, past the stern-faced secretary, down the long, silent corridor, and through the echoing lobby. She pushed her way out through the heavy oak doors, back into the noise and the light of the city. But the city no longer seemed vibrant. It seemed cold and indifferent. The grand buildings were not symbols of strength, but of an impenetrable, monolithic power. Lenin's outstretched arm no longer seemed to be exhorting the people to a brighter future. It seemed to be warning them to stay in their place. The long bus ride back to Zavitsk, 42, was a journey through a landscape of despair. She had knocked on the right door. She had followed the rules, and the door had been politely but firmly shut in her face. The wall of silence was higher and thicker than she had ever imagined. Elena had been right. She had been naive. And now, she had not only failed to help her friends, but she had painted a target on her own back. Voronov would be informed of her visit. Perhaps not today, perhaps not tomorrow. But the message would be passed down the chain of command. The shark would know that one of the small fish in his pond had tried to bite. As the bus pulled into the familiar, grimy terminal of Zavitsk, 42, the factory whistle blew, signaling the end of the evening shift. It was a sound she had heard every day of her life. But tonight, it sounded different. It no longer sounded like a warning. It sounded like a death knell. The aftermath of Anna's visit to Sverdlovsk was not the immediate, explosive retaliation she had feared, but something far more insidious. It was a creeping cold, a slow, deliberate tightening of a noose. Voronov did not summon her to his office. He did not confront her on the factory floor. Instead, he began to dismantle her world piece by piece, with the patient, bloodless cruelty of a spider. The first move was against her work. A new supervisor was appointed to the supply depot, a sour-faced man named Kalagin, who was known throughout the factory as one of Voronov's most loyal sycophants. Suddenly, Anna's ledgers were subject to intense, daily scrutiny. Kalagin would stand over her shoulder for hours, his stale breath smelling of cheap tobacco, pointing out minuscule, imagined errors. Consignments she had meticulously logged would be misplaced, only to be discovered later by Kalagin himself, who would then lecture her loudly on her incompetence in front of other workers. Her quiet, orderly domain became a place of constant, low-level psychological warfare. Next, he isolated her. Friends and acquaintances from other workshops, people she had shared meals and conversations with for years, began to avoid her gaze. A casual greeting in the corridor would be met with a hasty nod and a quick retreat. The seat next to her in the canteen would remain conspicuously empty. A rumor had begun to circulate, a poisonous, amorphous whisper that she was a troublemaker, an informer, someone who had tried to slander a good man for her own selfish reasons. She was becoming a pariah, an untouchable in the rigidly defined social structure of the factory. But the most painful blows were aimed at her small circle of friends. Elena, whose sharp intellect had always been valued, was abruptly reassigned from her skilled work in the technical library to a mind-numbing, repetitive job counting finished components on the main assembly line. It was a demotion in all but name, a deliberate attempt to dull her brilliant mind with monotonous labor. Daria, still a ghost of her former self, was assigned the most physically demanding and unpleasant tasks, forced to work overtime in the sweltering heat of the foundry's lower levels. It was punishment disguised as operational necessity. The dormitory room, once their sanctuary, became a pressure cooker of fear and resentment. Daria's silence curdled into a sullen, passive aggression. She would pointedly turn her back when Anna entered the room. A quiet question would be met with a hostile glare. While she never said the words, her silent accusation was clear. You made things worse. Your failed attempt at heroism brought this down on us. Svetlana, meanwhile, seemed to be disintegrating. She lived in a state of constant, high-strung terror. The slightest unexpected noise would make her jump. She developed a nervous tic, a constant smoothing of her work coat, her hands fluttering like trapped birds. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was in a timid, fragmented whisper. She was a ghost haunting the edges of their lives, and Anna's heart broke every time she looked at her. The only person who remained unchanged was Marina. The old woman, with her deep-seated wisdom and her survivor's pragmatism, seemed immune to the shifting political winds. She would sit with Anna during their brief, overlapping breaks, sharing her black bread and her quiet, unwavering support. "They are trying to break you, Anushka," she said one evening, her voice a low rumble. "This is how men like him work. They don't use a hammer when 1,000 tiny needles will do. They want you to break. They want you to beg. Don't give them the satisfaction. But Daria hates me. Anna whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. And Elena, she was right. I was a fool. Daria is afraid. Fear makes people cruel. Marina countered, placing a gnarled, work-roughened hand over Anna's. And Elena is angry at the system, not at you. You did what you thought was right. In a world like this, that is a brave and foolish thing to be. But it is not a wrong thing. The breaking point arrived on a frigid night in early December. The first snows of winter had fallen, blanketing the gray settlement in a deceptive layer of white purity. Anna was walking back to the dormitory, her head down against the biting wind, when she saw a figure huddled in the deep shadows of the bathhouse. It was Svetlana. She was sitting on the frozen ground, not even seeming to feel the cold, her body racked with deep, convulsive sobs. Anna rushed to her side, kneeling in the snow. Sveta, what is it? What happened? Svetlana looked up, her face a mess of tears and terror. He wants me to come to his dacha, she stammered, the words tumbling out in a torrent of panic. This weekend, he said it was a special reward for my good work. He said it would be just the two of us. He said I should be grateful for the opportunity. She grabbed Anna's arm, her fingers digging in like claws. I can't, Anna. I can't. I'd rather die. I swear it. I'll throw myself in the furnace. The raw, suicidal despair in her voice terrified Anna more than anything that had come before. This was no longer about harassment or intimidation. This was about survival. She half-carried, half-dragged the hysterical girl back to their dormitory. She burst into the room, kicking the door shut behind her. Elena was there, mending a tear in her work coat. Daria was lying on her bed, staring at the ceiling. He's trying to take her to his dacha, Anna announced, her voice shaking with rage. Svetlana collapsed onto her cot, her sobs now loud and unrestrained. Daria sat up, her face pale. The sullen anger in her eyes was replaced by a flicker of shared terror. The dacha, the director's country house, a place of rumor and legend, a private playground far from the prying eyes of the settlement. Elena stood up, her needle and thread forgotten. Her face was grim, her eyes hard as flint. She looked at the weeping girl, at Daria's terrified face, at Anna's desperate anger. She walked over to the door and bolted it. Enough, she said, her voice cutting through the hysteria. This ends. Tonight. She looked around the small, oppressive room. Not here, she said. The walls are too thin. She thought for a moment, her mind working with its usual swift, cold logic. The cellar. Under the kitchens. No one goes there at night. The cellar was a dark, subterranean world that smelled of damp earth, rotting potatoes, and pickling brine. It was a labyrinth of stone-walled rooms, filled with dusty crates, barrels of sauerkraut, and shelves of canned goods from the summer harvest. The only light came from a single, bare bulb hanging from a long cord, casting a weak, yellow glow that created more shadows than it dispelled. The air was cold and still. It was the perfect place for a conspiracy. Elena led them to a small, secluded chamber at the far end of the cellar, a room used for storing empty jars. She found an old wooden crate for them to sit on. Marina was already there. Elena must have fetched her from the kitchens, her presence a silent, solid affirmation of the gravity of the moment. They huddled together in the weak, flickering light, a small circle of fugitives in their own home. Svetlana had stopped crying, but she was trembling uncontrollably, her arms wrapped around herself. Daria sat with her head in her hands, her blonde hair a tangled mess. He will not stop, Elena began, her voice low and even, devoid of emotion. She was not panicking. She was analyzing a tactical problem. He has broken Daria's spirit. He is trying to destroy Anna's reputation. And now he is moving to consume Svetlana completely. If we stay here, we will be picked off, one by one. It is a mathematical certainty. So what do we do? Anna asked, her voice raw. There's nowhere to go. We can't go to the authorities. We can't fight him. Then we disappear, Elena said, the words dropping into the cold silence like stones. A stunned silence followed. Disappear? The concept was so vast, so final, it was almost impossible to comprehend. It meant leaving everything they knew, their jobs, their home, their very identities. It was a form of suicide. That's insane, Daria whispered, lifting her head. Her face was streaked with dirt and fear. Where would we go? We have no papers, no money. They would find us. They would catch us and drag us back. It would be worse. 1,000 times worse. They would only find us if they knew we were gone, Elena countered, her eyes gleaming with a fierce, dangerous intelligence. What if we weren't just gone? What if there was an accident? Anna stared at her, horrified. What are you saying? The old pump house, by the river. Elena continued, her voice still a low, conspiratorial whisper. The one that hasn't been used in years. The foundation is rotten. The ice on the river is thin there, near the warm water outlet from the main plant. A fire. A collapse. It wouldn't be the first industrial accident in a place like this. Tragic, but not unexpected. 5 workers, caught in the blaze, their bodies lost to the river. A terrible misfortune. The audacity of the plan was breathtaking. It was a desperate, mad gamble. But our papers, our workbooks, they're in the factory office, Anna pointed out, her mind struggling to keep up. I can get them, Elena said simply. I know the night watchman's routine. I know where the keys to the records office are kept. It would be a risk, a huge risk, but it's possible. And money? Daria asked, a flicker of something other than fear, a desperate, practical curiosity in her voice. It was Marina who answered. The old woman had been silent until now, her presence a heavy, grounding force. She reached into the deep pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a thick wad of worn, discolored ruble notes. It was a lifetime of savings, hoarded away for a rainy day that had now become a deluge. It is not much, she said, her voice a low rumble. But it is a start. Enough for a train ticket. Enough for a week, maybe 2, in a new place. After that, we are on our own. She looked around at their young, terrified faces, her own expression a mixture of profound sadness and unyielding resolve. I have lived my whole life in this place, she said, her gaze distant, as if seeing ghosts in the dusty air of the cellar. I was born in a village not far from here, a village that no longer exists. I saw the factory built. I have buried a husband and a son in its shadow. I thought I would be buried here, too. She paused, taking a deep, ragged breath. But I will not stand by and watch this man do to you what others have done to so many before. I am too old to run. I am too old to start a new life. But you are not. She pushed the bundle of money into Anna's hands. Her own hand was cold and trembling slightly. You must go. All of you. You must take this chance, no matter how small. The finality of her words hung in the air. The plan was no longer a theoretical exercise. It was real. It was tangible. It was a terrifying, fragile vessel that they could either board or watch sink without them. Svetlana looked up, her eyes wide with a desperate, dawning hope. The terror was still there, but it was now mixed with something else, a sliver of possibility. The idea of disappearing was no longer a form of death. It was a form of escape. Daria looked from the money in Anna's hand to Elena's determined face. The sullen resentment had vanished, replaced by the calculating look of someone weighing an impossible choice. A life of certain, slow destruction versus a leap into a terrifying, unknown freedom. But how? She whispered. How do we even get out of the settlement? The checkpoint. Fedor, Anna said, the name coming to her in a flash of inspiration. Uncle Fedor. The gruff, solitary driver of the long-haul truck that made weekly supply runs to a depot in the next oblast. He was a man who kept to himself, who despised the factory authorities, and who had once, years ago, helped Anna's mother get medicine that wasn't available in the settlement. He owed no loyalty to Voronov. He was an outsider, a man of the road. He is a good man, Marina nodded in confirmation. But a cautious one. It will not be easy to convince him. I will talk to him, Anna said, a newfound resolve hardening her voice. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a sense of purpose. She would not be a victim. She would not be a passive observer. She would be an agent of her own desperate salvation. They sat in the cold, dusty cellar for another hour, their whispered voices weaving the disparate, desperate threads of their plan into a fragile tapestry of escape. They worked out the timing, the logistics, the story they would use for Fedor. They decided who would be responsible for what. Elena would secure the documents. Anna would approach the driver. Daria would gather what little food and warm clothing they could smuggle out of the dormitory without raising suspicion. As they finally crept back up the cellar stairs, the factory whistle blew, its lonely cry signaling the beginning of the midnight shift. The beast was awake, demanding its tribute. But for the first time, its call did not fill Anna with dread. It was a ticking clock, a deadline. They had made a decision. They had chosen to fight back, not with confrontation, but with erasure. They would leap into the void. They would become ghosts, leaving nothing behind but the ashes of a tragic accident and the memory of 5 women who had simply vanished into the cold, unforgiving Russian night. The week that followed their subterranean pact was a masterclass in deception, a tightrope walk over a chasm of discovery. Every moment was a performance, every word a carefully chosen line in a play of excruciating tension. They had to maintain the facade of their brokenness, of their simmering resentments and quiet despair, while beneath the surface, the intricate machinery of their escape was being assembled, piece by desperate piece. For Anna, it was like living 2 lives simultaneously, the public life of the defeated, ostracized worker, and the secret life of a meticulous, terrified conspirator. Her first task, and the one upon which the entire plan hinged, was to approach Fedor. Uncle Fedor, as he was known to the few people he bothered to acknowledge, was a creature of routine. He was as much a part of the factory's landscape as the smokestacks, yet he was not of it. He lived in a small, isolated cabin on the very edge of the settlement, near the forest line, and he drove the same lumbering, mud-splattered ZAL 130 truck on the same route, twice a week, every week. He hauled finished components to a rail depot 200 kilometers to the west and returned with raw materials. He was a man carved from the same tough, gnarled wood as the trees that surrounded his cabin, with a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl and eyes that had seen too many kilometers of bad road. Anna knew that a direct approach would be a disaster. Fedor was pathologically suspicious of anyone who deviated from the norm. She couldn't just knock on his door. She had to create an opportunity, a seemingly chance encounter. She waited for a Tuesday, the day of his return journey. She knew he often stopped at a small, unofficial spring on the old logging road just outside the settlement to top up his radiator with clean water, grumbling about the corrosive, mineral-heavy water provided by the factory. Citing a migraine, a believable ailment given her recent stress, she got permission from a weary collagen to leave her shift an hour early. She walked out of the factory gates and, instead of turning towards the dormitory, headed for the logging road. The air was bitingly cold, and her breath plumed in front of her. She clutched a small, empty bucket, her prop for the encounter. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a frantic drum signaling the monumental risk she was taking. If anyone saw her, if Fedor refused, the entire plan would collapse. She found him just where she expected. The massive blue truck was pulled over to the side of the road, its engine rumbling like a sleeping bear. Fedor was crouched by the spring, a large canister in his hands. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion, a man entirely at peace in his solitude. Anna forced her feet to move forward, her boots crunching on the thin layer of snow. "Uncle Fedor?" He straightened up slowly, turning to face her. His expression was not welcoming. His eyes, set deep in a web of wrinkles, narrowed with suspicion. "What do you want, girl?" His voice was a low, gravelly rasp. I was just getting some water," she said, gesturing with her bucket. "My mother always said this water was better for tea." It was a weak, flimsy excuse, and she knew it. Fedor grunted, a sound of profound disbelief. He looked at her, his gaze sharp and penetrating, taking in her plain dress, her worried face, the desperation she was trying so hard to conceal. "Your mother's been dead 10 years, Anna Anisimova. And you've never come out here for water before in your life. So I'll ask again. What do you want?" His directness shattered her carefully constructed pretense. There was no point in lying. She took a deep breath, the cold air burning her lungs. "I need your help," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We need your help," she told him. Not everything, not the intimate, shameful details of Voronov's predation, but enough. She spoke of a powerful man making life impossible, of threats, of a future that held nothing but misery and danger. She framed it as a story he would understand. The abuse of power, the crushing of the small and insignificant by the big and connected. She told him they needed to leave, to disappear before something terrible happened. She spoke of 5 women who had nowhere else to turn. Fedor listened, his face an unreadable mask. He finished filling his canister, screwed the cap on with a deliberate twist of his powerful hands, and stood up. He walked back to his truck and placed the canister on the running board. He wiped his hands on an oily rag, his movements slow, methodical, giving no hint of his thoughts. Anna stood waiting, her hope shriveling with every passing second of his silence. She had failed. He was going to refuse. Or worse, he would report her. Finally, he turned to face her again. He reached into the pocket of his thick, sheepskin-lined coat and pulled out a crumpled pack of cheap, potent cigarettes. He lit one with a trembling hand, the flame of the match illuminating the deep, sorrowful lines of his face. "I had a sister," he said, the words coming out with a plume of blue smoke. "Younger than me. Worked at a textile mill in Ivanova years ago. There was a man there, a foreman, a man with a big position in the party." He took a long, deep drag on the cigarette. She never told anyone what he did. Not until it was too late. She was too ashamed, too afraid. One day, she just walked into the river. He stared off into the dense, dark woods, his eyes seeing a memory 1,000 kilometers and a lifetime away. The silence stretched, filled only by the rumbling of the engine and the sad sigh of the wind in the pines. "My truck leaves for the depot at 4 a.m. on Friday morning," he said, his voice gruff, his gaze still fixed on the trees. "The back will be loaded with crates of components. There is a space, behind the last row, big enough for cargo. The canvas is thick. No one will look." He turned his eyes back to her, and for the first time, she saw not suspicion, but a profound, weary sadness. "I will not be at the main gate. The night watchman there is one of Voronov's lackeys. There is an old service gate on the north side, near the slag heaps. The lock is rusted. A good kick will open it. Be there at 3:30. If you are not there, I will not wait. I will never speak of this again. Do you understand?" Anna could only nod, a wave of dizzying relief washing over her. Tears pricked at her eyes, freezing almost instantly on her lashes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me," he grunted, turning away and tossing the cigarette, but into the snow, where it hissed and died. "Just don't get caught." He climbed into the cab of his truck, the door groaning in protest. Without another word, he slammed it shut, engaged the gears with a deafening crunch, and rumbled away down the road, leaving Anna alone in the silence with a fragile, terrifying new reality. The first piece of the machine was in place. While Anna secured their transport, Elena embarked on the most dangerous part of the plan, securing their documents. Their Trudovai Nizki, their workbooks, and internal passports were their very identities. Without them, they would be non-persons, unable to get a job, secure housing, or even legally exist in a new city. They were locked away in the factory's records office, a place as secure as a bank vault. Elena spent 2 nights observing the office, a ghost in the factory's shadowed corridors during the quiet midnight shift. She mapped the route of the night watchman, a portly, asthmatic man named Boris who was more interested in his crossword puzzle and a hidden flask of vodka than in his duties. She timed his rounds, noting the long stretches he spent in the warmth of the boiler room. She identified the location of the key cabinet, a small, locked metal box in the main supervisor's office. The risk was immense. Getting the key to the cabinet was one thing, but the cabinet itself contained dozens of keys. She would have only a few precious minutes to find the right one for the records office. If she were caught, it wouldn't be a simple reprimand. It would mean accusations of sabotage, a visit from men in long coats, and a one-way trip to a place far colder than Zavitsk, 42. On the 3rd night, she made her move. She wore dark clothing and soft-soled shoes. She slipped through the factory like a phantom, her heart a cold, steady drum in her chest. She waited until Boris had passed on his round, his wheezing cough fading down the long hallway. She approached the supervisor's office. The lock was simple, a standard factory-issue model she had studied. Using a thin piece of metal she had painstakingly filed down from a stray hairpin, she worked at the lock. Her hands were steady, her mind a cold, focused instrument. After a tense minute that felt like an hour, she heard a soft, satisfying click. Inside, she found the key cabinet. Another lock, this one more difficult. Her hands began to sweat. She could hear the ticking of a large clock on the wall. each tick a countdown to discovery. The lock wouldn't yield. She was about to give up when she remembered something she had read in a pre-revolutionary detective novel. Sometimes, brute force is the most elegant solution. She found a heavy metal paperweight on the desk. A single, sharp, muffled blow, cushioned by her coat, was enough to break the flimsy lock. Inside was a daunting array of keys, each with a small, faded tag. Foundry B, Workshop 7, Main Warehouse. She scanned them frantically. Records office. There it was. She snatched it from its hook, along with the key for their own dormitory blocks file cabinet, where their personal records were kept. The rest was a blur of adrenaline-fueled efficiency. She retrieved their 5 files from the dormitory cabinet first, then moved to the main records office. The key worked. Inside, rows upon rows of gray metal cabinets stood like silent soldiers. She found the right drawer, her fingers flying through the files until she found their 5 workbooks. She tucked the precious documents inside her coat, her heart racing. She returned the keys, wiped every surface she had touched with a rag, and slipped back out into the night, a ghost carrying the weight of 5 stolen lives. Meanwhile, Daria and Marina were responsible for the logistics of their physical escape. Their task was to gather the essential items they would need for the first few days of their new life without raising any suspicion. It was a delicate operation. Taking too much would be noticed. Taking too little would be a death sentence in the harsh Russian winter. Marina, with her unquestioned access to the kitchens, was able to squirrel away durable, high-energy food, several loaves of dense black bread, a block of hard cheese, smoked sausage, and a bag of sugar cubes. She packed them in a small, nondescript canvas sack. Daria's task was more difficult. She had to gather their warmest clothing. Under the pretext of doing a large load of laundry, she collected their extra sweaters, woolen socks, and thickest undergarments. She packed them tightly into 2 bundles, wrapped in plain sheets to look like clean laundry. The most dangerous part was retrieving their felt winter boots, their Valenki. They were stored in a common drying room, and simply taking them would be noticed immediately. Her solution was born of a desperate cunning she didn't know she possessed. She accidentally spilled a bucket of dirty water near the boot rack, soaking their 5 pairs. With loud, theatrical complaints about the clumsiness of others, she declared them too wet to be left in the damp room and carried them back to their dormitory to dry by the radiator, a plausible excuse that masked their true purpose. The final piece of the puzzle was the creation of the accident. Elena's plan was to set a fire in the derelict pump house by the river. It needed to look convincing. They gathered old, oily rags from the workshop, a can of machine lubricant, and some discarded personal items, a worn-out scarf of Daria's, a single mitten of Svetlana's, a cheap metal locket of Anna's. These would be their remains, a few poignant, tragic clues to be discovered in the ashes. They would plant them in the pump house just before they left. The day of the escape, Friday, was a study in excruciating self-control. They went to their shifts as usual, performing their tasks with a mechanical, feigned normalcy. Anna felt as though she were watching herself from a great distance, a character in a play moving towards its final, tragic act. She avoided Collagen's glare, filled her ledgers with a steady hand, and nodded politely to the workers who shunned her. Every tick of the clock was a step closer to either freedom or disaster. Their last shift ended. They walked back to the dormitory for the last time, the setting sun casting long, skeletal shadows across the snow. They ate their final meal in the noisy canteen, the familiar clatter and chatter of the room now sounding alien and distant. Back in their room, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken goodbyes. They didn't speak of the escape. They spoke of small, ordinary things, a desperate attempt to maintain a semblance of normalcy. But underneath, the terror was a living thing, coiling in their stomachs. At midnight, when the dormitory was quiet and the only sound was the distant rumble of the factory and the sighing of the wind, they began their final preparations. They dressed in layers, pulling on every piece of warm clothing they had. They looked at each other, their familiar forms now bulky and strange. They were no longer factory workers. They were fugitives, preparing to step off the edge of the world. Elena pulled the stolen documents from their hiding place beneath the loose floorboard. She handed each of them their passport and workbook. Holding the small, official booklets in their hands was a profound, terrifying moment. These were the keys to their past, and their only hope for a future. Anna looked around the small, cramped room that had been her entire world. The narrow cots, the cracked plaster, the single grimy window looking out at the glowing, ever-present factory. She was leaving it all behind. She felt a pang of something that was almost grief, a sorrow for the simple, predictable life she was about to destroy. "It's time," Elena whispered, her voice tight. They moved in silence. Marina met them by the back stairs, pressing the sack of food into Daria's hands. She hugged each of them, her embrace fierce and brief. There were no tears. Their emotions were frozen too deep for that. "Go with God," Marina whispered, though none of them had thought about God in years. "Be smart. Be strong. Live." She watched them go, a small, stoic figure in the darkness, before turning and disappearing back into the labyrinth of the factory she would never leave. The five of them slipped out into the biting cold of the night. The snow crunched under their boots. The world was cast in the eerie, orange glow of the factory's sodium lamps. First, to the pump house. They planted the rags, the lubricant, the personal items. Elena, with a grim finality, struck a match. The oily rags caught with a hungry whoosh, and flames began to lick at the dry, rotten wood. They didn't stay to watch it burn. They ran, their movements clumsy in their bulky clothing, towards the north side of the settlement, towards the slag heaps and the old, rusted service gate. Their last shift was over. Their new one, the shift of the hunted, had just begun. The world beyond the service gate was a different planet. It was a realm of profound darkness and biting, untamed wind. The familiar, hellish orange glow of the factory was behind them, a malevolent eye watching their retreat, but ahead lay only an abyss of blackness, punctuated by the ghostly white of the snow-covered ground. The slag heaps rose around them like a range of dead, black mountains, their unnatural shapes stark against the starless sky. The air here was different, too. The perpetual metallic tang of the factory was replaced by the clean, cold scent of snow and pine and the faint, acrid smell of industrial waste from the heaps. They ran. It was not a graceful run, but a clumsy, desperate scramble through the deep snow. Their bulky layers of clothing, a blessing against the cold, were a curse on their movement, restricting their limbs and making them sweat despite the frigid air. Anna's lungs burned, each breath a searing intake of ice. Beside her, she could hear Svetlana's panicked, ragged gasps and Daria's low, breathless curses as she stumbled over an unseen rock. Only Elena seemed to move with a grim, forward momentum, her focus absolute, a beacon of pure will pulling them along. The rendezvous point was a stand of skeletal birch trees about 100 meters from the gate, a place where the road curved sharply, offering a brief pocket of concealment. They collapsed into the relative cover of the trees, their chests heaving, their legs trembling with exertion and adrenaline. Anna leaned against a thin, peeling trunk, her heart hammering a wild, frantic rhythm against her ribs. Fear was a physical thing, a living creature clawing at her insides. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into the shape of a pursuer. "Is he here?" Daria whispered, her voice a strained rasp, as she scanned the empty, snow-swept road. "He will be," Elena said, her own breathing only slightly labored. She checked the cheap, functional watch on her wrist, its luminous dial glowing a faint, eerie green in the darkness. "It's 3:35. We have 5 minutes. 5 minutes." It felt like a lifetime. The silence pressed in on them, vast and absolute. It was a silence they were not used to. The ever-present hum and roar of the factory, the background noise of their entire lives, was gone. Its absence was more unnerving than the noise itself. Here, in the quiet, every frantic heartbeat, every ragged breath, seemed deafeningly loud. Svetlana began to tremble violently, her teeth chattering. It wasn't just the cold. Her eyes were wide, darting back towards the distant glow of the factory. "The fire," she stammered. "They'll see the fire. They'll come." "That's the point, Sveta," Elena said, her voice sharp but not unkind. "We want them to see it. We want them to come. But we want them to be looking there, at the river, not here." Anna put an arm around the younger girl, pulling her close, trying to share what little body heat she had left. "It's all right," she murmured, the words a hollow reassurance. "We're almost there. Just a few more minutes." The minutes stretched into an eternity. 3:37, 3:39. Doubt, a cold and insidious serpent, began to uncoil in Anna's gut. What if he wasn't coming? What if he'd had second thoughts? What if he'd been stopped? They were stranded, 5 fugitives in the middle of a frozen wasteland, with a fire drawing attention to their disappearance and no way out. The sheer, monumental folly of their plan seemed to crush down on her. And then, a sound. It was faint at first, a low, distant rumble that was felt more than heard, a vibration carried through the frozen ground. It grew steadily, resolving itself into the unmistakable, throaty growl of a heavy truck engine. A moment later, 2 faint pinpricks of light appeared on the horizon, cutting through the darkness, swaying as the vehicle navigated the rutted road. A collective, shuddering sigh of relief passed through the group. He was coming. The ZL-130 truck lumbered into view, a monstrous, dark blue shape against the white snow. It slowed as it approached the curve, its headlights sweeping across their hiding place, momentarily blinding them. They shrank back into the shadows of the trees, their hearts in their throats. The truck came to a halt, its air brakes hissing loudly in the quiet night. The engine was left running, a rumbling promise of departure. The passenger side door creaked open, and Fedor's gruff voice cut through the air. "Get in. Now." There was no time for hesitation. They scrambled from the cover of the trees, their feet sinking into the deep snow. Fedor was already at the back of the truck, untying the heavy, frozen knots of the canvas tarp with his bare, calloused hands. Quickly, he grunted, not looking at them. "Get in. And be silent. Not a sound until I say so." He pulled the canvas back, revealing the dark, cavernous interior. The truck was packed almost to the top with large wooden crates, their contents a mystery. But just as he had promised, at the very back, behind the last row of crates, there was a small, coffin-like space. It was barely a meter high and perhaps 2 meters deep. It was their ark. Elena went first, swinging herself up with an athletic grace that belied the bulky clothing. She turned and helped the others. Svetlana had to be practically pushed and pulled, her limbs stiff with fear. Daria scrambled in next, her movements frantic. Anna followed, her hands and knees scraping against the rough wooden floor of the truck bed. It smelled of sawdust, grease, and something faintly chemical. The space was claustrophobically small. The 5 of them were crammed together, a tangle of limbs and coats. They couldn't stand, they could barely sit upright. Their shoulders pressed against each other, their knees knocked together. It was a dark, suffocating, human puzzle. Fedor's face appeared in the opening, a grim shadow against the faint light. "I will cover you. There is a small gap in the crates on the left side. You can get air. But do not make a sound. We have to pass one more checkpoint on the main highway, 20 kilometers from here. They check papers sometimes. If they hear you, we are all dead. Understand?" They all murmured their understanding. He gave a curt nod, and then the heavy canvas flap fell, plunging them into absolute, suffocating darkness. They heard him retying the knots, his movements swift and sure. A moment later, they heard the cab door slam shut. The truck lurched as the gears engaged, and then, with a deep groan of protest from the suspension, they began to move. They were on their way. The journey in the back of the truck was a unique form of torture. The darkness was total, a disorienting void where the only sense of reality was the violent motion of the vehicle. The truck swayed and bounced on the poorly maintained road, throwing them against each other and the hard wooden crates. Every jolt sent a jarring shock through Anna's body. The rough floorboards scraped at her knees and elbows. The air was cold and stale, thick with the smell of engine fumes that seeped in from below. The small gap in the crates that Fedor had mentioned provided only a meager trickle of fresh, freezing air. The confinement was a physical pressure, amplifying their fear. There was no room to stretch, no room to move. They were trapped, blind and helpless, their fate entirely in the hands of the silent, grim men in the cab. The only sounds were the rumble of the engine, the creak and groan of the truck's chassis, and their own strained, shallow breathing. No one spoke. The silence was a pact, a shared discipline born of mortal terror. Anna could feel Svetlana trembling beside her, a constant, low-frequency vibration. She reached out in the darkness and found the girl's hand, her fingers as cold as ice. She squeezed it, a small, desperate act of reassurance in the void. After what felt like an eternity, the truck began to slow. The rumble of the engine dropped to a low idle. Anna's heart leaped into her throat. The checkpoint. She held her breath, straining her ears. She could hear faint, muffled voices from outside, a man's voice, sharp and official, and Fedor's low, gravelly response. The words were indistinct, lost to the thick canvas and the engine noise, but the tone was clear. It was an interrogation. A heavy silence followed. Anna imagined a guard walking around the truck, his flashlight beam probing the shadows, his eyes searching for any sign of irregularity. She pictured him tapping on the canvas, his hand just inches from her face. She squeezed Svetlana's hand so hard she was afraid she might break it. Beside her, she could feel Elena go absolutely rigid, a statue carved from pure tension. Then, she heard the sound of a heavy fist banging against the side of the truck, right next to her head. The sound was so loud, so sudden, it was like a gunshot in the confined space. Svetlana let out a tiny, strangled gasp, a sound that Anna immediately tried to smother with her hand. More muffled voices. Fedor's voice was a low, steady rumble, calm and unhurried. The other voice was sharp, insistent. Anna's mind raced. They had been heard. It was over. The door would be thrown open, the light would flood in, and their desperate gamble would end in a squalid, miserable failure. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Anna could feel the frantic pulse in her own neck, a wild counterpoint to the steady thrum of the engine. And then, just as suddenly, she heard a laugh. A gruff, dismissive laugh from the guard outside. Fedor's voice said something else, something that sounded like a joke. The cab door opened and closed. A moment later, the truck lurched forward, slowly at first, and then began to pick up speed. They were through. A collective, silent exhalation of breath filled the small space. The tension, so thick it had been almost unbearable, began to dissipate, leaving behind a shaky, trembling exhaustion. Anna felt lightheaded, dizzy with relief. She leaned her head back against a hard wooden crate, her body limp. They drove for what must have been another 2 hours. The road smoothed out, and the violent bouncing was replaced by a steady, hypnotic swaying. The darkness, the confinement, the rhythmic motion of the truck, and her own bone-deep exhaustion began to work on Anna. Her terror gave way to a profound, weary numbness. Her eyelids grew heavy. Despite the cold and the discomfort, she felt herself drifting, her mind sliding into a shallow, fitful sleep, her hands still clutching Svetlana's in the dark. She was woken by the truck slowing again, this time coming to a complete stop. The engine was cut, and the sudden, absolute silence was jarring. A moment of panic flared in her before she heard Fedor's voice from outside the canvas. "You can come out." Light flooded their dark world as he untied the flap and threw it back. It was not the harsh, artificial light of the factory, but the soft, gray, pre-dawn light of a new day. They were parked in a muddy, desolate-looking lot next to a small, sleepy railway station. A single track stretched off into the misty distance in either direction. The air smelled of damp earth, coal smoke, and rain. They tumbled out of the back of the truck, their limbs stiff and aching, their bodies bruised and sore. They stretched, blinking in the unfamiliar light, 5 disheveled, exhausted figures in a strange new world. Fedor stood by the cab, smoking another of his potent cigarettes. He looked as weary as they felt. He didn't look at them directly, instead focusing his gaze on the railway tracks. "The train to the east comes in 40 minutes, he said, his voice flat. "It is a local. Slow. It stops everywhere. No one will be checking papers on a train like this. It will take you away from here. Where you go after that is your business." Anna stepped forward, pulling the small, cloth-wrapped bundle of Marina's money from her coat pocket. "We have to pay you, Uncle Fedor. For the fuel. For the risk." He looked at the money in her hand and then at her face. For a moment, she saw that same profound sadness in his eyes, the memory of a sister lost to a river. He shook his head, a single, sharp gesture of refusal. "Keep it," he grunted. "You will need it more than I do." He took one last drag on his cigarette and flicked it away. "I never saw you. This never happened. Go." He turned and climbed back into the cab of his truck without another word, without a backward glance. He started the engine, and a moment later, the ZL 130 rumbled out of the muddy lot and disappeared down the road, leaving them alone on the platform. They stood in silence, watching him go, their last link to their old life severed. They were 5 women, with a small sack of food, a bundle of clothes, a handful of money, and the stolen documents that were their only claim to an identity. They were fugitives, ghosts, non-persons. Anna looked at her friends. Elena stood tall, her face grim but resolute, already scanning the station, planning their next move. Daria looked around, a dazed, almost wondrous expression on her face, as if she couldn't quite believe they were free. Svetlana clung to Anna's arm, her trembling finally starting to subside, a flicker of something like hope in her tired eyes. A distant whistle echoed down the tracks. Their train was coming. Anna looked back in the direction they had come from, towards the west, where Zavitsk 42 lay hidden in the gray morning mist. She thought of the fire, now likely a smoldering ruin. She thought of the discovery, the feigned shock, the official investigation that would conclude with their names being listed as tragic victims. They were dead back there. But here, on this cold, remote platform, shivering in the dawn of a new, terrifyingly uncertain day, they were, for the first time in a very long time, alive. The unknown stretched before them, a vast and perilous country. They had escaped. But their journey, Anna knew with a chilling certainty, had only just begun. The train that arrived was not a symbol of progress or a shining example of Soviet engineering. It was a slow, weary beast, a local electrica that seemed to exhale a sigh of profound exhaustion as it hissed to a stop at the desolate platform. Its green paint was faded and peeling, its windows clouded with the grime of 1,000 journeys. It was a train for peasants, for minor officials, for people moving between the anonymous, forgotten towns that dotted the vast expanse of the Russian interior. It was the perfect vessel for 5 ghosts. They boarded a half-empty carriage, the air inside thick with the smell of wet wool, cheap tobacco, and the faint, sour odor of unwashed bodies. They found a set of facing benches, hard wooden seats that promised little comfort, and sank onto them. The other passengers, a collection of stoic, weathered faces, barely gave them a second glance. In their bulky, mismatched coats and with the weariness of a sleepless, terrifying night etched onto their faces, they blended in perfectly with the downtrodden landscape. They looked like what they were, people on the run from a life that had become untenable. The train lurched into motion, its rhythmic clatter a hypnotic, comforting sound after the violent chaos of the truck. Anna pressed her forehead against the cold, grimy glass of the window and watched the world slide by. It was a landscape of stark, monochrome beauty. Endless forests of silver birch and dark pine, their branches heavy with snow. Small, huddled villages with smoke curling from their chimneys. Vast, empty fields lying fallow under a blanket of white. It was a world she had never seen, and its sheer, overwhelming emptiness was both terrifying and liberating. For the first time, she felt the true, physical distance they were putting between themselves and Zavitsk, 42. Every click of the wheels on the track was a step further away from Voronov, a step further into the unknown. For the first few hours, no one spoke. They were suspended in a state of communal shock, processing the enormity of what they had done. Daria sat with her eyes closed, her face a pale, slack mask of exhaustion. Svetlana had finally succumbed to her weariness, her head lolling onto Anna's shoulder, her breathing deep and even in a sleep that was a mercy. Elena, however, was alert. She had pulled a worn, creased map from her small bundle of belongings and was studying it with an intense, focused concentration, her brow furrowed as she traced potential routes with a finger. She was no longer just an escapee, she was the navigator of their new existence. It was Elena who finally broke the silence. "We need a story," she said, her voice a low, urgent whisper that cut through the rhythmic clatter of the train. The others looked at her. "We can't just be 5 women traveling together without a reason. It's suspicious. We need identities. A history. We need to become other people." She pulled out a small, stubby pencil and a few sheets of coarse paper she had taken from the factory. "From this moment on, we are no longer who we were. We are a family. Sisters. Cousins. Fleeing a tragedy. It's a story people will understand. It's a story that will evoke pity, not suspicion." Thus began the first act of their reinvention. In the rocking, grimy carriage of an eastbound train, they began to weave the tapestry of their new lives. Elena, with her cold, pragmatic logic, was the architect. They would be the Petrova family. Their home village in the Kirov Oblast had been destroyed in a flash flood late in the autumn, a plausible, if dramatic, explanation for their lack of belongings and their sudden displacement. They had lost everything and were traveling east to stay with a distant, fictitious relative in a larger city, hoping to start anew. The new names were chosen with care. They had to be common, unremarkable names that wouldn't draw attention. Elena became Ekaterina, the steadfast older sister, a name that suited her serious, commanding presence. Daria, with her fair hair and once bright eyes, became Galina, a name that held a ghost of her former, sunnier self. Svetlana, the youngest and most fragile, was christened Tanya. And Anna, the quiet observer, chose the name Olga. It felt plain, solid, anonymous. It was a name she could hide behind. "Say them," Elena instructed, her voice like a drill sergeant's. "Say your new names. Get used to the feel of them in your mouth. You are no longer Anna, Daria, Svetlana. You are Olga, Galina, Tanya. Your old names are dead. They died in the fire at the pump house." They practiced, their voices low and hesitant at first, whispering the alien syllables to each other. "Hello, I am Olga Petrova. This is my younger sister, Tanya." It felt like a bizarre, morbid play, but they all understood its life or death importance. A single slip, a moment of hesitation when asked for a name, could unravel everything. Their destination was another matter. Their meager funds, Marina's life savings, would not last long. They needed to find a place where they could disappear, a place large enough to be anonymous but with enough industry to offer work, even to women with questionable pasts and no references. After hours of studying the map, Elena pointed to a city. Omsk, she declared. It was a name on a map, a major industrial hub in the heart of Siberia, hundreds upon hundreds of kilometers away. It was a place of exile, both historical and modern, a city built on the labor of those sent there against their will. It seemed fitting. It was a city large enough to swallow them whole, a place where no one would think to look for 5 factory workers from a small settlement in the Urals. The journey to Omsk took 3 days. 3 days of an endless, rattling journey eastward. They changed trains twice, moving from the slow local Electrica to a more crowded, long-distance train, always choosing the cheapest, most uncomfortable class of travel Platzkart, the open bunk carriages where privacy was non-existent. They lived on Marina's black bread and sausage, rationing it carefully. They slept in shifts, always with one person awake to watch over their small, precious bundles of belongings. Life in the Platzkart carriage was a crash course in their new, invisible existence. The carriage was a microcosm of the Soviet Union, a rolling community of soldiers on leave, students returning to university, families visiting relatives, and shadowy figures with shifty eyes. They learned to be quiet, to observe, to draw no attention. They kept to themselves, their story of family tragedy a shield that deflected the casual curiosity of their fellow travelers. They arrived in Omsk on a bitterly cold morning. The city greeted them with a vast, gray, snow-leaden sky and a brutal wind that swept across the plains. The train station was a chaotic swirl of humanity, a babble of shouted conversations and loudspeaker announcements. After the relative quiet of their journey, the sheer scale of the city was overwhelming. It was a sprawling, industrial behemoth, its skyline dominated by the smokestacks of countless factories and power plants. For the first time since their escape, Anna felt a true, bone-deep despair. They were here? But what now? They were 5 women, alone and anonymous in a vast, indifferent city, with only a handful of rubles and a fabricated story to their names. Elena, as always, was their rock. She navigated them through the chaos of the station, her expression grim and determined. Their first priority was shelter. They found a bleak, grim-looking dormitory on the outskirts of the city, a place that rented out cots by the night to transient workers, no questions asked. The room was even more squalid than their dormitory in Zavitsk, 42, with peeling, damp-stained walls and a single, fly-spotted bulb for light. But it was a roof over their heads. It was a place to hide. The next priority was work. The 5 of them, now the Petrova sisters, began the grueling, soul-destroying process of looking for jobs. They walked for miles through the frozen city, from one factory gate to another, their precious documents, their new identities clutched in their hands. It was a harsh education in the realities of their situation. Their story of being flood victims from Kirov earned them some sympathy, but no one was willing to hire 5 women at once. Their workbooks, showing years of experience at a factory that had supposedly just been built, raised eyebrows. They were met with suspicion, with bureaucratic indifference, with the leering gazes of foremen who saw their desperation as an opportunity. Days turned into a week. Their money was dwindling at an alarming rate. The meager diet of bread and cheap tea was taking its toll. They were all losing weight, their faces becoming gaunt, their eyes shadowed with a new kind of fear, the fear of starvation and homelessness. The initial elation of their escape had curdled into a grim, daily struggle for survival. The camaraderie that had sustained them began to fray under the relentless pressure. Daria, now Galina, became withdrawn and prone to sudden, inexplicable fits of weeping. Svetlana, Tanya, reverted to her state of terrified silence, barely leaving the squalid dormitory room. It was Anna, Olga, who found their salvation. She had been turned away from a dozen factories when she saw a small, handwritten sign pasted on the wall of a textile mill, a sprawling, soot-stained brick complex that looked as though it had been there since the time of the Tsars. The sign read simply, "Seamstresses needed. Piecework." She went inside. The foreman was a gruff, elderly man with kind eyes, a man who reminded her faintly of Marina. He looked at her worn clothes, her thin face, and her desperate expression. He listened to her story, the now well-rehearsed tale of the Petrova sisters. He looked at her workbook, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I can't hire all of you," he said, his voice gruff. "The mill is not a charity. But piecework, that's different. You get paid for what you produce. If you are fast, you eat. If you are slow, you starve. It is simple." He looked at her again, a long, appraising look. "Can you sew?" "Yes," Anna said, her voice stronger than she felt. "We all can. We are hard workers." He nodded slowly. "All right. Bring your sisters tomorrow morning. We will give you a trial. If your work is good, you can stay. But I am warning you, the work is hard, the pay is poor, and no one here will hold your hand." It was a lifeline. A fragile, frayed lifeline, but a lifeline nonetheless. The next day, the 5 of them started work at the Omsk textile mill. The work was brutally monotonous, their days a blur of flying needles and the deafening clatter of hundreds of sewing machines. They sat in long rows, their heads bent over their machines, sewing endless seams on military uniforms, their fingers quickly becoming raw and calloused. The pay, as the foreman had warned, was pitiful. But it was enough. It was enough for the rent on their squalid room. It was enough for bread and potatoes and cabbage. It was enough to survive. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to build a new life, a life under different names. They established a routine. They woke in the dark, walked through the frozen streets to the mill, worked for 10 hours in the deafening noise, and returned in the dark to their small room. They rarely spoke to their fellow workers, maintaining their quiet, insular existence. They were the Petrova sisters, the quiet ones from Kirov who kept to themselves. The years began to blur, one hard season bleeding into the next. 1979 became 1980. 1980 became 1981. They moved from the transient dormitory to a small, 2-room apartment in a crumbling pre-revolutionary building, a place that felt like a palace after their previous squalor. They were still poor, still living on the margins, but they were survivors. The constant fear of discovery began to recede, replaced by the dull ache of a past that would not be erased. The ghosts of Zavitsk 42 still haunted them, but they learned to live with them. They never spoke of Voronov. They never spoke of the fire. They never used their old names, not even amongst themselves. To do so felt like a betrayal of the fragile new reality they had constructed. But the past was a poison that had seeped too deep. The trauma they had endured manifested in different ways. Daria, Galina, never truly recovered her laughter. She remained a quiet, melancholic woman who found solace only in the repetitive motion of the sewing machine. Svetlana, Tanya, was a bird with a permanently broken wing. She was terrified of men, of authority, of loud noises. She rarely left the apartment except to go to work, her world having shrunk to the small, safe space she shared with her sisters. And Anna, Olga, became the keeper of their story, the silent archivist of their shared trauma. She watched over her friends, her quiet strength the glue that held their fractured family together. She had escaped the factory, but she realized with a growing, sorrowful certainty that a part of her would be trapped there forever. They had disappeared from the world, but they could not disappear from themselves. They had survived, but survival, she was beginning to understand, was not the same as being whole. The rhythm of their life in Omsk settled into a grueling, monotonous pattern, a life measured not in years, but in the accumulation of small, hard-won victories and the slow, inevitable erosion caused by a past that refused to stay buried. The deafening roar of the textile mill became their new factory whistle, the endless river of olive-drab fabric their new reality. They were the Petrova sisters, a fixture at the mill, known for their quiet diligence and for keeping to themselves. They had achieved a state of invisibility, a fragile peace bought at the price of their true identities. But time, which was supposed to be a healer, proved to be a slow-acting poison, and the cracks in their carefully constructed facade began to show. The first to be lost was not one of them, but their silent benefactor, their anchor to the old world. In the spring of 1982, nearly 3 years after their escape, a small, discreetly worded notice appeared in Trud, the National Trade Union newspaper, a paper Elena, Ekaterina, still read with a morbid, compulsive regularity. The notice announced the passing of Antonina Petrovna, the formidable workshop supervisor from Zavitsk 42, who had finally succumbed to her long illness. The small paragraph praised her decades of service and her unwavering dedication to the factory. There was no mention of the cloud under which she had been forced into retirement. The news, small as it was, hit their small apartment like a shockwave. For Anna, it was the severing of another tie, a poignant reminder of the decent people they had been forced to leave behind. She remembered Antonina's gruff kindness, her fierce protectiveness, the sanctuary of her small, cluttered office. She had been the last bastion of the old, predictable world before Voronov had arrived and set it on fire. But the news had a more devastating effect on Svetlana Tanya. In her traumatized mind, Antonina Petrovna had taken on a mythical quality. She was the guardian who had kept the monsters at bay. Her death seemed to signify that the last gatekeeper was gone, that the world was now a place entirely without protection. Tanya's already fragile mental state began to deteriorate more rapidly. Her nights were filled with muffled sobs and terrifying nightmares from which she would wake up screaming, her eyes wide with a terror that did not fade with the dawn. She would whisper Voronov's name in her sleep, a name that was otherwise unspoken, a cursed word in their small home. The others did their best to comfort her, to anchor her to their present reality, but she was drifting away from them, pulled under by the currents of a trauma too deep to heal. She became more reclusive than ever, her fear of the outside world hardening into a full-blown agoraphobia. Eventually, she could no longer face the daily walk to the mill. She quit her job, confining herself entirely to the two small rooms of their apartment. She would spend her days cleaning obsessively, or simply sitting by the window, staring out at the gray Omsk sky with vacant eyes. Her sister's meager earnings now had to support all five of them, a new and heavy strain on their fragile finances. She was a living ghost, a constant, heartbreaking reminder of the true cost of their escape. The first irreparable loss from within their own circle came in the winter of 1985. It was Marina. She had been their rock, the quiet, steady heart of their small family. Despite her age, she had worked as tirelessly as any of them, her gnarled hands surprisingly nimble at the sewing machine. But the years of hard labor and the accumulated sorrows of a long, difficult life had taken their toll. She began to slow down, her breathing becoming labored, her steps unsteady. One morning, she simply could not get out of bed. A stroke, the doctor they finally, reluctantly called to their apartment, diagnosed. A massive one. She lingered for a week, unable to speak, her eyes, once so full of wisdom, now clouded with confusion and pain. The four younger women took turns sitting by her bedside, holding her hand, whispering stories of their shared past, trying to offer a comfort they did not feel themselves. In her final lucid moment, she looked at Anna, a flicker of her old self returning to her eyes. She squeezed Anna's hand, a faint, papery pressure, and her lips formed a single, silent word. Live. Then she was gone. Her death plunged them into a new kind of crisis. They had to bury her. But who were they burying? They could not bury Marina, the woman who had been their surrogate mother, the woman who had given them her life savings and her blessing. To the state, Marina did not exist. They were forced to bury Anastasia Petrova, their beloved fictional aunt. The funeral was one of the most painful experiences of Anna's life. It was a cold, anonymous affair at a windswept municipal cemetery on the edge of the city. A handful of neighbors from their apartment building came to pay their respects to the quiet old woman they barely knew. The four of them stood by the open grave, their faces numb with a grief they could not properly express, listening to an indifferent state official recite a few hollow, secular platitudes. They were mourning not just the loss of a loved one, but the erasure of a life. They were burying a lie, and with it, a piece of their own history. Marina's death changed the dynamic of their small group. The steady, quiet center was gone. The burden of leadership now fell entirely on Elena Ekaterina, and the weight was beginning to crush her. Ekaterina, who had always been so strong, so logical, so focused, began to change. The fierce pragmatism that had engineered their escape curdled into a brittle, obsessive need for control. She became stricter, more demanding. She managed their meager finances with an iron fist, counting every kopeck, rationing their food with a severity that bordered on punitive. She drove herself and the others harder at the mill, constantly pushing them to increase their output, to earn a few extra rubles. The bookish intellectual who had once read forbidden poetry was replaced by a grim-faced taskmaster. The fire in her eyes, once a flame of fierce intelligence, was now a banked, smoky coal of perpetual anxiety. She rarely smiled. She had built the walls of their new life, and now she was consumed with reinforcing them, terrified that the slightest crack would bring the entire structure crashing down. Anna saw the toll it was taking on her. She saw the new, deeper lines around her eyes, the gray that was beginning to streak her dark hair, the way her hands, when she thought no one was looking, would tremble slightly. "You're working too hard, Katya," Anna would say gently. "You need to rest. Rest is a luxury we cannot afford, Alya," Ekaterina would retort, her voice sharp. Do you think this life runs itself? Do you have any idea how close we are, every single day, to disaster? In 1989, more than a decade after their escape, the disaster she had feared for so long finally arrived, but not from the outside. It came from within. Ekaterina fell ill. It started as a persistent, hacking cough, which she dismissed as a common cold, a consequence of the damp, cold air in the factory. But the cold did not pass. It deepened. She grew thin and pale, her energy draining away. A fever took hold, leaving her weak and drenched in sweat at night. For weeks, she refused to see a doctor, her deep-seated mistrust of all authority figures overriding her own well-being. She insisted on going to work, often having to stop and lean against a wall, overcome by violent fits of coughing. Finally, one evening, she collapsed on the floor of their apartment, a thin trickle of blood on her lips. Anna and Daria, terrified, managed to get her to a hospital. The diagnosis was swift and brutal. It was not just pneumonia. It was advanced lung cancer, likely caused by years of breathing in the fine, carcinogenic dust of the textile mill. It was inoperable. The hospital ward was a bleak, sterile purgatory. Ekaterina, the strongest of them all, was reduced to a frail, skeletal figure lost in a starched white bed. The disease ravaged her body with a terrifying speed. But as her body weakened, her mind, for a while, seemed to sharpen, to clear. The obsessive anxiety that had consumed her fell away, replaced by a raw, lucid clarity. One afternoon, when Anna was sitting by her bedside, Ekaterina reached out and gripped her hand. Her grip, though weak, was surprisingly firm. "Alya," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "You have to promise me something." "Anything, Katia," Anna said, her throat tight with tears. "My real name," she rasped, a flicker of the old Elena returning to her eyes. "My name is Elena." "Say it." "Elena," Anna whispered, the name feeling both strange and profoundly right on her tongue after so many years. "Promise me, Anna," Elena continued, using Anna's real name for the first time in a decade, a gift of truth from her deathbed. "Promise me that this wasn't all for nothing. Our running. Our hiding. Marina's anonymous grave. Daria's lost laughter. Tanya's broken mind." Her eyes burned with a final, desperate intensity. "He is still out there. Voronov. I know it. He's probably thriving. A respected man. While we rot away in this Siberian backwater. That cannot be the end of the story. The world cannot be that unjust. What can I do?" Anna wept. "Who would ever believe us? It's been so long. We have no proof." "The proof is what we have become," Elena whispered, her breath shallow. She gestured weakly around the bleak hospital room. "This is the proof. But you're right. It's not enough. Not yet." She paused, gathering her strength. "Promise me that one day, when the time is right, you will tell our story. When the country changes. When people are ready to listen. When he is old and weak and can no longer hurt anyone. You have to tell them what he did. Not for revenge, Anna. For the truth. For all the other Svetlanas and Darias he may have destroyed after we left. Silence protects men like him. It never protects the victims. Promise me." "I promise," Anna sobbed, clutching her friend's thin, cold hand. "I promise, Elena." A faint, peaceful smile touched Elena's lips. "Good," she whispered. "You were always the strongest, Anna. The quietest, but the strongest." Elena died 2 days later. She was buried next to Marina, in the same anonymous cemetery, under the name Ekaterina Petrova. Another lie, another piece of their history shoveled under the cold Siberian earth. Her death was the blow that shattered their small, fragile family. She had been their leader, their strategist, their intellectual center. Without her, they were adrift. The apartment felt vast and empty. The silence was no longer a comfort, but a crushing weight. Daria, Galina, retreated even further into herself, a silent, grieving shell. And Svetlana, Tanya, seemed to break completely. The death of their fierce protector was the final straw. Her mind, already so fragile, snapped. She began talking to people who weren't there, her conversations a jumble of memories from their village life and fragmented, terrifying whispers about the factory. Anna was left to hold the pieces. She was now the sole provider, the caretaker, the keeper of a promise that felt impossibly heavy. She worked a double shift at the mill, her body aching with a fatigue that went far beyond physical exhaustion. She came home to a silent, grieving sister and another who was lost in the labyrinth of her own mind. She felt a despair so profound it was almost a physical illness. She had lost her home, her name, and now, two of the people who were her only family. She was Olga, a poor seamstress in Omsk, but inside, she was Anna, a woman haunted by the ghosts of her past and shackled by a promise she had no idea how to fulfill. One evening, sitting alone in the quiet apartment after the others were asleep, she found Elena's small stash of hidden things. Tucked away in a small wooden box, she found not poetry, but a small, cheap notebook. She opened it. Inside, in Elena's small, precise handwriting, was a chronicle. It was a detailed, meticulous record of their last few months in Zavitsk, 42. Dates, times, incidents. Voronov's words, quoted verbatim. A description of the bruise on Darya's arm. The scene Anna had described from the corridor. It was all there, a testament written in the cold, clear language of an indictment. On the last page, Elena had written a final entry, dated the night before their escape. If you are reading this, Anna, it means I am gone, and the burden is now yours. I have documented this not for our sakes, but for the sake of history, for the sake of the truth. I do not know if it will ever be of use. But a story that is not written is a story that can be denied. Do not let them deny what was done to us. Do not let us die in vain. Anna closed the notebook, her hands trembling. Elena, ever the strategist, had left her one last weapon. A weapon of words. It was a dangerous inheritance, a testament that could either be their salvation or their final damnation. She wrapped the notebook in an oilcloth and hid it away, a seed of truth planted in the frozen ground of their Siberian exile, waiting for a spring that might never come. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the chaotic birth of the new Russia, these were events that Anna and her remaining sisters experienced not as grand, historical upheavals, but as a series of distant, confusing tremors. They watched the seismic shifts on a small, flickering black and white television in their Omsk apartment, the grainy images of toppled statues and political speeches feeling as though they were broadcast from another planet. For them, life remained a relentless, daily struggle for survival, and the grand promises of perestroika and glasnost did not immediately trickle down to the grimy, forgotten corners of a Siberian textile mill. The 1990s were a harsh, hungry decade. The collapse of the old system brought not freedom, but chaos. The factory, now privatized, often failed to pay their wages for months at a time, forcing them to rely on their small garden plot and the kindness of neighbors. The city of Omsk became a grimmer, more dangerous place, the old, oppressive order replaced by the raw, predatory laws of nascent capitalism. Yet, in a strange way, the chaos provided a new kind of camouflage. In a country where millions of lives were being upended, where histories were being rewritten and identities were in flux, the story of the Petrova sisters seemed less and less remarkable. They were just three more pieces of driftwood caught in the turbulent currents of a nation reinventing itself. The years continued their relentless march. Darya, Galina, faded quietly, a candle guttering in the wind. The silent melancholy that had claimed her spirit eventually claimed her body. She developed a persistent, racking cough, a legacy of the dusty mill, and in the winter of 1998, she passed away in her sleep from pneumonia, her body too weary to fight anymore. She was buried next to Marina and Elena under her false name, another secret interred in the frozen Siberian soil. Now there were only two: Anna, Olga, and Svetlana, Tanya. Tanya's mind had long since retreated into a world of its own, a fragile sanctuary built of fragmented memories and gentle delusions. She was no longer tormented by the sharp edges of her trauma. Instead, she lived in a perpetual, hazy past. Some days she was a young girl in her home village, chattering happily about milking the cows or picking berries in the forest. Other days, she would be meticulously folding laundry, believing she was helping her mother prepare for a village festival. She rarely recognized Anna as a sister, instead treating her with the gentle, polite deference one might show a kind landlady or a benevolent caretaker. Anna cared for her with a quiet, unwavering devotion. She had become Olga so completely that the name no longer felt like a costume. It was her identity, forged in the crucible of loss and responsibility. The fierce, frightened girl who had fled Zavitsk, 42, was buried under layers of scar tissue, replaced by a stoic, middle-aged woman with tired eyes and hands gnarled from decades of sewing. The promise she had made to Elena was a distant, dormant thing, a heavy stone at the bottom of a deep, dark well of memory. How could she think of fulfilling it? The world had changed, but Voronov was likely a ghost, and she had Tanya to care for. Her life was here, in this small apartment, with this broken woman who was the last living link to her stolen past. The catalyst for change arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a mouse. It was the year 2007. Anna, now in her late 50s, had been laid off from the textile mill, which had finally gone bankrupt. To make ends meet, she did small sewing and mending jobs from her apartment. Her neighbors, knowing her as the quiet, reliable Olga, would bring her their torn coats and frayed trousers. One of these neighbors, a young university student, had paid her for a repair not with cash, but by helping her set up a slow, dial-up internet connection on a second-hand computer. For Anna, the internet was a strange and overwhelming universe. But one lonely, sleepless night, driven by a sudden, inexplicable impulse she hadn't felt in years, she typed a name into the search bar. Not her own, not her sister's. She typed, Zavitsk 42. The search yielded a handful of results. The factory, now part of a larger industrial conglomerate, was still operating, though at a fraction of its former capacity. The settlement was now officially on the map, a grim, struggling town grappling with unemployment and decay. And then she saw it. A link to the town's local online newspaper. It was a recent article, dated just 2 weeks prior, celebrating the 75th anniversary of the factory's founding. The article was a piece of bland, predictable local boosterism, filled with talk of glorious history and hopeful futures. And then she saw the photograph. It was a picture of a group of local dignitaries standing on a stage. In the center of the group, slightly stooped with age but still possessing an undeniable aura of authority, was a man with familiar, icy eyes and a still handsome, angular face. The caption underneath read, "And lifelong contributor to our town's success, honored citizen, comrade director Valentin Voronov." Anna felt the air leave her lungs. A cold dread, a feeling she had not experienced with such intensity in nearly 30 years, washed over her. He was there. He had never left. He wasn't just a survivor. He was an honored citizen, a pillar of the community. The man who had destroyed their lives, who had driven one of them to madness and had set the others on a path that led to early, anonymous graves, was being celebrated as a hero. The promise she had made to Elena erupted from the depths of her memory, no longer a dormant stone but a burning coal in her chest. Do not let him win forever. Do not let us die in vain. The rage that followed was a clean, purifying fire. It burned away the years of fear, of resignation, of the dull, gray apathy that had become her shield. For the first time in decades, she was not Olga, the weary seamstress. She was Anna Anisimova, and she had a debt to pay. A new, terrifying, and utterly unshakable resolve took hold of her. The path forward was insane, suicidal even. But it was the only path there was. She had to go back. The practicalities of such a journey were staggering. She couldn't leave Tanya alone. For weeks, she agonized over the problem. The solution, when it came, was from an unexpected quarter. An elderly neighbor, a retired nurse named Sophia, had always shown a special, gentle affection for Tanya. Seeing Anna's distress, she offered to look after her. "You look like you are carrying the weight of the world, Alia," she said, her kind eyes full of concern. "Go. Do what you have to do. I will care for Tanya as if she were my own. She will be safe with me." It was the final piece she needed. With a mixture of terror and grim determination, Anna began to make her preparations. She gathered her meager savings. She packed a small, sturdy bag with a change of clothes and the few essentials she would need. And from its hiding place, where it had lain untouched for nearly 20 years, she retrieved Elena's small, cloth-wrapped notebook. The ink on the pages was faded, the paper yellowed and brittle, but the words were still there, a clear, damning testament. She placed the notebook in her bag. It was her only weapon. She bought a one-way train ticket. Westbound. The journey back was the reverse of her escape, a journey back through time, back towards the source of her pain. As the train rumbled across the vast Siberian plains and into the dense forest of the Urals, Anna felt the layers of Olga peeling away, leaving the raw, younger self she had tried to bury for so long. The fear returned, sharp and immediate, but this time it was different. It was no longer the paralytic terror of a victim. It was the cold, focused fear of a soldier going into battle. She arrived in Zavitsk 42 on a bleak, gray afternoon. The town was even more dilapidated than she remembered. Many of the old apartment blocks were crumbling, their windows boarded up. The streets were filled with a sense of listlessness and decay. The factory, once a roaring behemoth, now seemed to sigh a constant, weary plume of gray smoke into the sky. It was a town haunted by its own glorious past. She did not go to her old dormitory. She did not know if it was even still standing. Instead, she found a small, cheap room to rent above a bakery, paying in cash and giving a false name. For 2 days, she simply walked. She was a ghost in her own hometown, a stranger walking through the landscape of her memories. She walked past the factory gates, past the crumbling administrative building, past the patch of scorched earth by the river where the pump house had once stood. It was all so familiar, yet so alien. Her purpose was not nostalgia. It was reconnaissance. She needed to understand the town as it was now. She needed to find an ally. She couldn't just walk up to Voronov's door. She couldn't go to the local police, who would still be in the pocket of the town's most powerful man. She needed someone who was not part of the old guard, someone with a conscience, someone who might be willing to listen to an impossible story. She found him in the pages of the same local newspaper that had brought her back. His name was Pavel Morozov, a young journalist who wrote a weekly column called Forgotten Histories. His articles were different from the rest of the paper's propagandistic fluff. He wrote about the town's forgotten heroes, about the difficult, unspoken parts of its past, about the human cost of its industrial triumphs. There was a current of idealism and a quiet anger in his writing that resonated with Anna. He was an outsider, a young man trying to speak truth in a town built on convenient lies. He was a risk, but he was her only hope. His office was a small, cluttered room at the back of the newspaper building, filled with teetering stacks of old books and yellowing newspapers. He was younger than she expected, perhaps in his late 20s, with untidy hair, glasses perched on his nose, and an intense, curious expression. He looked up, surprised, as she entered. "Can I help you, comrade?" he asked, using the old-fashioned form of address with a hint of irony. Anna stood before his desk, her small bag clutched in her hand, her heart pounding. The moment had come. The promise she had made on a deathbed in a Siberian hospital nearly 2 decades ago was about to be honored. "My name is not Olga Petrova," she began, her voice low and trembling, but clear. "And I am not a comrade." Pavel looked at her, his curiosity piqued. "My real name," she said, pulling Elena's notebook from her bag and placing it on his desk, "is Anna Anisimova. I used to work here, at the factory. And according to the official records, I died in a fire 30 years ago." Pavel stared at her, then at the notebook, his mouth slightly agape. The cynical, world-weary journalist vanished, replaced by a young man who sensed he was on the verge of the story of a lifetime. The air in the small, dusty room crackled with the weight of a history that had refused to stay buried. "Sit down," he said, his voice a whisper of awe and anticipation. "And tell me everything." Pavel Morozov's office, a cramped sanctuary of ink-stained wood and yellowing paper, became Anna's confessional. The story that had been locked away for 3 decades, a story she had only ever revisited in the silent, tormented recesses of her own mind, now poured out of her. At first, her voice was hesitant, a rusty hinge groaning open after years of disuse. She stumbled over names and dates, the memories thick with the dust of time. But as she spoke, a strange and terrible fluency took hold. The past became present, the ghosts taking on flesh and blood in the small, cluttered room. Pavel listened with an intensity that was almost a physical force. He did not interrupt. He leaned forward, his elbows on his desk, his chin resting in his hands, his eyes, magnified by his thick glasses, fixed on her face. He was not just hearing her words. He was absorbing them, living them with her. He was a cartographer mapping the geography of her pain. She told him everything. She started with the gray, predictable world of Zavitsk, 42 before Voronov, the simple camaraderie of their dormitory room, the innocent dreams of Daria, the fierce intelligence of Elena. She painted a vivid picture of their small, self-contained universe before the serpent entered the garden. Then she described Voronov's arrival, the slow, insidious poisoning of the atmosphere, the way his charisma was a mask for a chilling, predatory nature. She spoke of the bruise on Daria's arm, the extinguished light in her eyes. She described the horrifying tableau she had witnessed through the crack in his office door, Svetlana's silent, frozen terror. She recounted her naive, desperate journey to Sverdlovsk, the dismissive coldness of the party official, Comrade Petrov, the suffocating wall of silence she had crashed against. Her voice broke as she described the slow, cruel retaliation, the isolation, the psychological warfare that had been waged against them. Pavel's expression shifted as she spoke. His initial journalistic curiosity deepened into shock, then into a quiet, simmering indignation. This was not just a story of workplace harassment. It was a story of absolute power corrupting absolutely, of a system designed not to protect the weak but to insulate the powerful. The heart of her story, and the part that made Pavel sit bolt upright, was the escape. The secret meeting in the cellar, Marina's life savings, Elena's audacious plan for the fire. She described the terrifying journey in the back of Fedor's truck, the claustrophobic darkness, the heart-stopping moment at the checkpoint. She spoke of their reinvention as the Petrova sisters, the grueling journey to Omsk, the years of hard, anonymous labor at the textile mill. And then came the litany of losses. Her voice grew heavy, thick with a grief that 30 years had not diluted. She spoke of Marina's anonymous grave, of Elena's deathbed promise, of Daria's quiet fading. She described Svetlana's descent into madness, a living casualty of a war no one else knew had been fought. She was not just recounting events. She was erecting tombstones of memory for the sisters she had lost. When she finally fell silent, the small office was filled with the weight of her narrative. The story hung in the air between them, a tangible, sorrowful presence. Her throat was raw, her body trembling with the aftershocks of her confession. She felt utterly exposed, utterly vulnerable. She had handed this young stranger the fragile, broken pieces of her life. Pavel did not speak for a long time. He seemed unable to. He simply stared at her, his face a mixture of awe, horror, and a profound, empathetic sorrow. Finally, he reached out a slightly trembling hand and touched the small, worn notebook that lay on his desk between them. "This," he said, his voice husky. "This is her diary? The one your friend Elena kept?" Anna nodded. She was meticulous. She wrote it all down. He opened the notebook with the reverence of an archaeologist handling a sacred text. He read the faded, precise script, his eyes moving quickly across the pages. He saw the dates, the names, the verbatim quotes. He saw the cold, factual, damning indictment that Elena had penned on the eve of their disappearance. This was not just an old woman's rambling, grief-stricken memory. This was evidence. This was a voice from the grave. He closed the notebook gently. "Anna Anisimova," he said, using her real name with a quiet respect. "I believe you. Every word." The simple declaration was a key turning a lock in Anna's soul. After 30 years of being a lie, of being Olga, of being a ghost, someone finally saw her. Someone believed her. The relief was so overwhelming that she finally broke, the stoicism she had maintained for decades crumbling away. She buried her face in her hands and wept, deep, racking sobs of grief and absolution, for her lost sisters, for her lost life, for the terrified young girl she had once been. Pavel waited patiently until her sobs subsided. He did not offer empty platitudes or clumsy reassurances. He gave her the gift of his quiet, respectful silence. When she had finally composed herself, his demeanor had changed. The thoughtful, curious writer was gone, replaced by a determined, focused journalist with a fire in his eyes. "We are going to publish this," he said, his voice ringing with a new conviction. "But we have to be smart. We can't just print your story as is. Voronov is still the most powerful man in this town. He has friends, influence. He will crush us. He will say you are a delusional old woman seeking attention, that the notebook is a forgery. We need more. We need corroboration." Thus began their own conspiracy, a partnership forged in the dusty newspaper office. For the next week, they worked together, moving with a caution that bordered on paranoia. Pavel, using his journalist credentials as a cover, began to dig. He started with the official archives. He found the original report on the pump house fire of 1979. It was exactly as Elena had predicted, a brief, cursory investigation concluding in a verdict of accidental death for 5 female workers, their bodies presumed lost in the river. The names were listed: Anna Anisimova, Elena Volkova, Daria Ivanova, Svetlana Popova, and a 5th, Marina Sokolova. A tragic but closed case. He then tried to find any record of Anna's complaint to the regional committee in Sverdlovsk. He spent 2 days on the phone, navigating a labyrinth of modern Russian bureaucracy, only to be met with dead ends. The records from that era were unavailable, archived off-site, or had simply been lost. The system was still protecting its own, its walls of silence still standing, albeit with a new coat of paint. The most crucial task was to find other voices, other victims. Pavel knew this would be the most difficult and dangerous part. Voronov's reign had been long. The fear he had instilled would have deep roots. He started with the women of Anna's generation who still lived in the town. He approached them carefully, under the guise of writing a nostalgic piece about life at the factory in the 70s. He would sit in their small kitchens, drinking tea, listening to their stories. At first, they spoke only of the good things, the camaraderie, the pride in their work. Their stories filtered through the soft, forgiving lens of nostalgia. But Pavel was a skilled interviewer. He would gently steer the conversation towards Voronov. He was a very dynamic director, wasn't he? He would prompt. And he would watch their faces. He saw the flicker of fear in a woman's eyes, the way another would suddenly become intensely interested in stirring her tea, the abrupt change of subject. He saw the old, familiar patterns of avoidance. The breakthrough came with a woman named Ludmilla, a retired crane operator with a sharp tongue and weary eyes. After an hour of polite, evasive conversation, Pavel took a gamble. "Ludmilla," he said, leaning forward, his voice low. "I am not just writing a nostalgia piece. I have spoken to someone from your workshop. Someone who left a long time ago. Someone named Anna Anisimova." The teacup in Ludmilla's hand rattled in its saucer. Her face went pale. "That's not possible," she whispered. "Anna died. In the fire." "She didn't die, Ludmilla. She ran away," Pavel said gently. "And she told me why." He watched as a lifetime of buried fear and resentment warred on the old woman's face. She looked at the door, as if expecting Voronov himself to burst in. She looked at Pavel, her eyes filled with a desperate, fearful hope. "He was a pig," she finally spat, the word a venomous whisper. "A monster. We all knew. We were too afraid to speak. He had a way of picking one. A young one, usually. He would shower her with attention, praise, small gifts. And then he would corner her. He would break her. We all saw it happen. Over and over. After Anna and her friends disappeared, he was quiet for a while. But then he started again. She began to cry, silent, bitter tears for a youth spent in fear. My own niece, she worked at the factory for a year in the mid-'80s. She left suddenly. Never told us why. She moved to Vladivostok and never came back. Now I know." Ludmilla's testimony was the first crack in the dam. She gave Pavel the names of 2 other women who she knew had been harassed. One had died, but the other, a woman named Sophia, was still living in the town. Pavel went to her. Bolstered by the knowledge that she was not alone, Sophia, after much hesitation, told her own story, a sordid tale of unwanted advances, threats to her job, and years of quiet shame. While Pavel gathered testimonies, Anna embarked on her own painful mission. She had to find Fedor. She didn't know if he was still alive, or if he even still lived in the area. She went to his old cabin by the forest. It was abandoned, its windows boarded up, its roof sagging. She asked around at the local truck depot, describing him to the younger drivers. Most of them shook their heads, but one older mechanic remembered him. "Uncle Fedor?" "Yeah, he retired years ago. A real hermit. Last I heard, he was living in a small village about 30 kilometers from here. A place called Sosnovka." Anna took a local bus to Sosnovka. She found him living in a tiny, weathered wooden house with a large, unkempt garden. He was an old man now, stooped and frail, his face a roadmap of deep wrinkles. But his eyes, when he opened the door and saw her standing there, were as sharp as ever. He recognized her instantly. A look of profound shock, followed by a flicker of what looked like fear, crossed his face. "You," he rasped, his voice thin and reedy. "It's me, Fedor," Anna said softly. "It's Anna." She told him why she had come back. She told him about her sisters, about their deaths, about her promise. She asked for nothing, only that he knew she had returned to finish what they had started. He listened, his expression grim. "I always wondered what became of you," he said when she had finished. "I heard about the fire. I thought, maybe you didn't make it to the station." He shook his head. "That man, Voronov, he is still here. Still a big man in this town. You were playing with fire, girl. A fire bigger than the one you set at the pump house." "I know," she said, "but I have to do this." He looked at her, at the quiet, unshakable resolve in her eyes. "I am an old man," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "My life is almost over. But if they ask me, if someone with real authority comes and asks me, I will not lie. I will tell them I took 5 frightened girls out of this town in the back of my truck in the middle of the night. It is the last true thing I have left to do." It was the final piece of corroboration Pavel needed, a living witness to the escape itself. Now they were ready. Pavel wrote the article. It was the most difficult, most important piece of his life. He laid out the story with a clear, devastating precision. He began with the official story of the 1979 fire and the 5 dead workers. Then he introduced Anna's voice. But one of those women did not die. Her name is Anna Anisimova, and she has come back to tell the truth. He wove her narrative together with excerpts from Elena's diary, with the corroborating testimonies of Ludmilla and Sophia, and with the confirmation of the escape from a retired truck driver. He painted a portrait not just of a single predator, but of a system that enabled him, a culture of fear that silenced his victims, and the terrible, lifelong human cost of that silence. He titled the article simply, "I Am Anna." The night before the paper was due to go to print, he and Anna sat in his office, reading the final draft. The small room was quiet. "Are you ready for this?" Pavel asked her gently. "When this comes out, your life will never be the same. You will no longer be Olga, the quiet seamstress. You will be Anna, the accuser. They will attack you. They will call you a liar, a madwoman. It will be a battle." Anna looked at the article, at the words that held the weight of 30 years of pain and sorrow. She thought of Elena, of Marina, of Daria, of Svetlana. She thought of her promise. "I have been hiding for 30 years, Pavel," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I am not afraid of the light." The publication of I Am Anna was not an explosion. It was an earthquake. It began as a low, subterranean rumble that shook the very foundations of Zavitsk, 42. The local newspaper, usually filled with bland pronouncements and agricultural reports, became an incendiary document, passed from hand to hand in the factory canteen, in the dreary queues at the bread shop, in the small, cramped kitchens of the apartment blocks. It was read first with disbelief, then with a dawning, horrified recognition. The story was so monumental, so at odds with the town's carefully curated history, that the initial reaction was a stunned, collective silence. It was as if a ghost had walked into the middle of the town square and begun to speak, her voice echoing across decades of willful ignorance. Voronov's reaction was swift and predictable. He was a cornered animal, and he lashed out with the full force of his remaining power and influence. The day the article appeared, his lawyers filed a lawsuit against the newspaper and against Pavel Morozov personally, for slander and defamation. He issued a public statement, published in a rival regional paper, dismissing the story as the senile, vindictive fantasy of a disturbed woman. He painted Anna as a disgruntled former employee who had likely embezzled funds and fled 30 years ago, only to return now with a preposterous story to extort money from a respected citizen. He claimed Elena's diary was a crude and obvious forgery. He was, he declared, the true victim, his lifetime of dedicated service to the community being maliciously attacked. For a few days, it seemed as though his strategy might work. The town was divided. The old guard, the party functionaries and factory managers who had built their careers in his shadow, rallied to his defense. They spoke of his leadership, his contributions, his unimpeachable character. They whispered that the young journalist, Pavel, was a reckless agitator, and that the old woman was clearly mentally unstable. The fear that Voronov had cultivated for decades was a powerful weapon. Many people were simply too afraid to publicly question him. Anna found herself ostracized once more. She received anonymous, threatening phone calls at the small room she rented. "Liar," a voice would hiss before hanging up. "Go back to the hole you crawled out of, old witch." But this was not the Soviet Union of 1979. The world had changed. The dam of silence, cracked by Pavel's article, had begun to crumble. The story was too powerful to be contained. A journalist from a larger, independent Moscow newspaper, intrigued by the local lawsuit, picked it up. He came to Zavitsk, 42, and did his own investigation. He interviewed Anna, Pavel, Ludmila, and Sofia. He spoke to Fedor, whose quiet, simple confirmation of the escape was devastatingly effective. His national feature, published a week later, amplified Anna's voice 1,000-fold. The story of the Zavitsk Five became a national sensation. Television crews descended on the small, forgotten town. Zavitsk, 42, was suddenly at the center of a firestorm, forced to confront the monster it had harbored in its midst for over a generation. The national attention brought a new level of scrutiny, and with it, new voices. The story reached Vladivostok, where Ludmila's niece, now a middle-aged woman herself, read it online. After a week of agonizing indecision, she came forward, telling her own story of how Voronov had harassed her as a teenager, forcing her to flee the town and her family. Another woman, who had been a young Komsomol leader in the early 80s, contacted the Moscow paper, recounting how Voronov had used his position to pressure her into a sexual relationship, promising career advancement in exchange for her silence. The trickle of corroboration became a flood. The narrative was no longer Anna's word against a powerful man's. It was a chorus of female voices, singing a terrible, harmonious song of abuse that spanned decades. The pressure on the authorities, both local and regional, became immense. The lawsuit, intended to silence Pavel, backfired spectacularly as it opened Voronov up to the legal process of discovery. The regional prosecutor's office, under the glare of the national media spotlight, had no choice but to open a formal criminal investigation. While the statute of limitations had long since expired on many of the older crimes, the newer allegations of abuse of power fell within a prosecutable timeframe. Voronov was summoned for questioning. The images of him, an old, stooped but still defiant man, pushing his way through a throng of reporters outside the prosecutor's office, were broadcast across the country. The mask of the honored citizen was stripped away, revealing the snarling, cornered predator beneath. The most profound shift, however, happened within the town itself. The weight of evidence became too much to deny. People were forced to re-examine their own memories, to see past the facade they had accepted for so long. Neighbors who had shunned Anna now approached her on the street, their eyes filled with shame and sorrow. "We are sorry," a woman whispered to her outside the bakery. "We knew. We just didn't want to know." The town was engaged in a painful, collective act of soul-searching. They had to accept that their hero was a monster, that their history was built on a foundation of silence and suffering. The process was agonizing, but it was also a form of liberation. The truth, once spoken, could not be unsaid. The legal and ecclesiastical fallout was decisive. The criminal case eventually stalled due to Voronov's failing health and the legal complexities of the old crimes. But the court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict. The regional governor's office, in a public ceremony, formally stripped Voronov of his honored citizen status. The factory board voted to remove his portrait from the hall of directors. The local party chapter, now a pale shadow of its former self, issued a formal apology to the victims. He was erased from the town's official history as thoroughly as he had tried to erase Anna and her sisters. A few months after the story broke, Voronov, a broken and disgraced man, suffered a major stroke. He was left partially paralyzed and unable to speak. His family, unable or unwilling to care for the pariah he had become, placed him in a state-run nursing home in a distant town. He disappeared from public life, his final years to be lived out in silence and ignominy, a fate that held a terrible, poetic justice. For Anna, the fall of her tormentor brought not joy, not triumph, but a profound, quiet sense of peace. The war was over. The promise had been kept. She did not stay a ghost in Zavitsk, 42. With the help of Pavel and a fund that was started by the Moscow newspaper, she was able to make arrangements for Tanya's long-term care in a quiet, specialized sanatorium near Omsk, where she would be safe and looked after by professionals like the kindly Sophia. Then, Anna made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She decided to reclaim her past, not by living in it, but by transforming it. The factory, in an attempt to distance itself from the scandal, offered a settlement. It wasn't a huge sum, but it was enough. At the same time, the town, in its own act of penance, was trying to decide what to do with the now derelict dormitory building where the story had begun. Anna had a vision. She used the settlement money and worked with Pavel to establish a foundation. They acquired the old dormitory building. It was gutted, renovated, and reborn. The small, oppressive rooms were knocked down, the grimy walls repainted in bright, warm colors. The place where so many women had lived in fear was transformed into the Zavitsk, 42 Women's Center, a crisis shelter, a legal aid office, and a community hub for women facing abuse and hardship. It was named, informally, the House of the Five. Anna became its director. She was no longer a victim, no longer a fugitive, no longer an accuser. She was a builder, a healer. Her quiet, observant nature, once a tool for survival, now became her greatest strength. She listened to the stories of other women, her presence a calm, steady anchor in the storm of their lives. She didn't offer easy answers or false reassurances. She offered something far more valuable, her belief. She offered them the simple, powerful gift of being heard. Pavel remained a close friend and a board member of the center. His life had also been transformed. He was no longer a small-town journalist writing for an obscure paper. He had become a nationally recognized voice for investigative journalism, a champion for the forgotten and the silenced. But he chose to stay in Zavitsk, 42. "This is where the real stories are," he would say. "This is where the work matters." Fedor passed away peacefully in his sleep a year after the story broke. Before he died, he donated his old truck to the center, where it was lovingly restored by local volunteers and used to transport supplies and donations. It sat proudly in the driveway, a monument not to an escape, but to the quiet courage of an ordinary man who chose to do the right thing. On a cool, clear autumn afternoon, a year after the center opened, A small ceremony was held in the garden that had been planted where the old coal heaps used to be. 5 simple birch trees were planted. At the base of each tree was a small, granite plaque. They read, Marina Sokolova. She gave us the means. Elena Volkova. She gave us the plan. Daria Ivanova. She gave us her laughter. Svetlana Popova. She gave us the reason. Anna Anisimova. She gave us a voice. Anna stood before the small grove, her hand resting on the plaque that bore her own name. She was an old woman now, her hair as white as the birch bark, her face a testament to a life of hardship and sorrow. But her eyes were clear. The fear was gone. She thought of Elena's final words, the promise extracted on a deathbed. She had done it. She had told their story. She had not let them die in vain. She looked at the transformed building behind her, the House of the Five, filled now with the sounds of women talking, laughing, crying, healing. She looked at the 5 young trees, their leaves rustling in the wind, a living memorial to her lost sisters. Justice, she had learned, was not always about punishment. Sometimes, it was about reclamation. It was about turning a place of pain into a place of healing. It was about ensuring that the ghosts of the past could finally find their peace, not by being forgotten, but by having their stories told, their truths acknowledged, their memory honored. A young woman who had recently arrived at the center, her face still bearing the fresh bruises of her own escape, came and stood beside her. It's beautiful, the young woman said softly, looking at the trees. Yes, Anna replied, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Yes, it is. The sun was beginning to set, casting a long, warm, golden light over the garden. The factory whistle blew, signaling the end of the day shift. For the first time, it did not sound to Anna like a warning or a death knell. It sounded, simply, like a distant echo from another life. The dawn had been long in coming, but here, in this small garden of memory and rebirth, it had finally arrived.